20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 17, An Underwater Forest. We had finally arrived on the outskirts of this forest, surely one of the finest in Captain Nemo's immense domains. He regarded it as his own, and had laid the same claim to it that, in the first days of the world, the first men had to their forests on land. Besides, who else could dispute his ownership of this underwater property? What other bolder pioneer would come, axe in hand, to clear away its dark underbrush? This forest was made up of big tree-like plants, and when we entered beneath their huge arches, my eyes were instantly struck by the unique arrangement of their branches, an arrangement that I had never before encountered. None of the weeds carpeting the seafloor, none of the branches bristling from the shrubbery, crept or leaned or stretched on a horizontal plane. They all rose right up toward the surface of the ocean. Every filament or ribbon, no matter how thin, stood ramrod straight. Fucus plants and creepers were growing in stiff perpendicular lines, governed by the density of the element that generated them. After I parted them with my hands, these otherwise motionless plants would shoot right back to their original positions. It was the regime of verticality. I soon grew accustomed to this bizarre arrangement, likewise to the comparative darkness surrounding us. The seafloor in this forest was strewn with sharp chunks of stone that were hard to avoid. Here the range of underwater flora seemed pretty comprehensive to me, as well as more abundant than it might have been in the Arctic or tropical zones where such exhibits are less common. But for a few minutes I kept accidentally confusing the two kingdoms, mistaking zoophytes for water plants, animals for vegetables. And who hasn't made the same blunder? Flora and fauna are so closely associated in the underwater world. I observed that all these exhibits from the vegetable kingdom were attached to the seafloor by only the most makeshift methods. They had no roots and didn't care which solid object secured them, sand, shells, husks, or pebbles. They didn't ask their hosts for sustenance, just a point of purchase. These plants are entirely self-propagating, and the principle of their existence lies in the water that sustains and nourishes them. In place of leaves, most of them sprouted blades of unpredictable shape, which were confined to a narrow gamut of colors consisting only of pink, crimson, green, olive, tan, and brown. There I saw again, but not yet pressed and dried like the Nautilus's specimens, some peacock's tails spread open like fans to stir up a cooling breeze, scarlet rose-tangle, sea-tangle stretching out their young and edible shoots, twisting strings of kelp from the genus Nereocystis that bloomed to a height of 15 meters, bouquets of mermaids' cups, whose stems grew wider at the top, and a number of other open-sea plants, all without flowers. It's an odd anomaly in this bizarre element, as one witty naturalist puts it. The animal kingdom blossoms, and the vegetable kingdom doesn't. These various types of shrubbery were as big as trees in the temperate zones. In the damp shade between them, there were clustered actual bushes of moving flowers, hedges of zoophytes in which there grew stony coral striped with twisting furrows, yellowish sea anemone from the genus Caryophylla with translucent tentacles, plus anemone with grassy tufts from the genus Zoantheria, and to complete the illusion, minnows flitted from branch to branch like a swarm of hummingbirds, while there rose underfoot, like a covey of snipe, yellowfish from the genus Lepisocanthus with bristling jaws and sharp scales, flying gurnards, and pine-cone fish. Near 1 o'clock, Captain Nemo gave the signal to halt. Speaking for myself, I was glad to oblige, and we stretched out beneath an arbor of winged kelp, whose long thin tendrils stood up like arrows. This short break was a delight. It lacked only the charm of conversation. But it was impossible to speak, impossible to reply. I simply nudged my big copper headpiece against Conseil's headpiece. I saw a happy gleam in the gallant lad's eyes, and to communicate his pleasure he jiggled around inside his carapace in the world's silliest way. After 4 hours of strolling, I was quite astonished not to feel any intense hunger. What kept my stomach in such a good mood, I'm unable to say. But in exchange, I experienced that irresistible desire for sleep that comes over every diver. Accordingly, my eyes soon closed behind their heavy glass windows, and I fell into an uncontrollable doze, which until then I had been able to fight off only through the movements of our walking. Captain Nemo and his muscular companion were already stretched out in this clear crystal, setting us a fine nap-time example. How long I was sunk in this torpor I cannot estimate, but when I awoke, it seemed as if the sun were settling toward the horizon. Captain Nemo was already up, and I had started to stretch my limbs when an unexpected apparition brought me sharply to my feet. A few paces away, a monstrous, meter-high sea spider was staring at me with beady eyes, poised to spring at me. Although my diving suit was heavy enough to protect me from this animal's bites, I couldn't keep back a shudder of horror. Just then Conseil woke up, together with the Nautilus's sailor. Captain Nemo alerted his companion to this hideous crustacean, which a swing of the rifle butt quickly brought down, and I watched the monster's horrible legs writhing in dreadful convulsions. This encounter reminded me that other, more daunting animals must be lurking in these dark reaches, and my diving suit might not be adequate protection against their attacks. Such thoughts hadn't previously crossed my mind, and I was determined to keep on my guard. Meanwhile, I had assumed this rest period would be the turning point in our stroll, but I was mistaken, and instead of heading back to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued his daring excursion. The seafloor kept sinking, and its significantly steeper slope took us to greater depths. It must have been nearly 3 o'clock when we reached a narrow valley gouged with high, vertical walls and located 150 meters down. Thanks to the perfection of our equipment, we had thus gone 90 meters below the limit that nature had, until then, set on man's underwater excursions. I say 150 meters, although I had no instruments for estimating this distance, but I knew that the sun's rays, even in the clearest seas, could reach no deeper. So at precisely this point, the darkness became profound. Not a single object was visible past 10 paces. Consequently, I had begun to grope my way when suddenly I saw the glow of an intense white light. Captain Nemo had just activated his electric device. His companion did likewise. Conseil and I followed suit. By turning a switch, I established contact between the induction coil and the glass spiral, and the sea, lit up by our 4 lanterns, was illuminated for a radius of 25 meters. Captain Nemo continued to plummet into the dark depths of this forest, whose shrubbery grew ever more sparse. I observed that vegetable life was disappearing more quickly than animal life. The open sea plants had already left behind the increasingly arid seafloor, where a prodigious number of animals were still swarming: zoophytes, articulates, mollusks, and fish. While we were walking, I thought the lights of our Ruhmkorff devices would automatically attract some inhabitants of these dark strata, but if they did approach us, at least they kept at a distance regrettable from the hunter's standpoint. Several times I saw Captain Nemo stop and take aim with his rifle. Then, after sighting down its barrel for a few seconds, he would straighten up and resume his walk. Finally, at around 4 o'clock, this marvelous excursion came to an end. A wall of superb rocks stood before us, imposing in its sheer mass. A pile of gigantic stone blocks, an enormous granite cliffside pitted with dark caves but not offering a single gradient we could climb up. This was the underpinning of Crespo Island. This was land. The captain stopped suddenly. A gesture from him brought us to a halt, and however much I wanted to clear this wall, I had to stop. Here ended the domains of Captain Nemo. He had no desire to pass beyond them. Farther on lay a part of the globe he would no longer tread underfoot. Our return journey began. Captain Nemo resumed the lead in our little band, always heading forward without hesitation. I noted that we didn't follow the same path in returning to the Nautilus. This new route, very steep and hence very arduous, quickly took us close to the surface of the sea. But this return to the upper strata wasn't so sudden that decompression took place too quickly, which could have led to serious organic disorders and given us those internal injuries so fatal to divers. With great promptness, the light reappeared and grew stronger, and the refraction of the sun, already low on the horizon, again ringed the edges of various objects with the entire color spectrum. At a depth of 10 meters, we walked amid a swarm of small fish from every species, more numerous than birds in the air, more agile too, but no aquatic game worthy of a gunshot had yet been offered to our eyes. Just then I saw the captain's weapon spring to his shoulder and track a moving object through the bushes. A shot went off, I heard a faint hissing, and an animal dropped a few paces away, literally struck by lightning. It was a magnificent sea otter from the genus Enhydra, the only exclusively marine quadruped. 1.5 meters long, this otter had to be worth a good high price. Its coat, chestnut brown above and silver below, would have made one of those wonderful fur pieces so much in demand in the Russian and Chinese markets. The fineness and luster of its pelt guaranteed that it would go for at least 2,000 francs. I was full of wonderment at this unusual mammal, with its circular head adorned by short ears, its round eyes, its white whiskers like those on a cat, its webbed and clawed feet, its bushy tail. Hunted and trapped by fishermen, this valuable carnivore has become extremely rare, and it takes refuge chiefly in the northernmost parts of the Pacific, where in all likelihood its species will soon be facing extinction. Captain Nemo's companion picked up the animal, loaded it on his shoulder, and we took to the trail again. For an hour, plains of sand unrolled before our steps. Often the seafloor rose to within 2 meters of the surface of the water. I could then see our images clearly mirrored on the underside of the waves, but reflected upside down. Above us there appeared an identical band that duplicated our every movement and gesture. In short, a perfect likeness of the quartet near which it walked, but with heads down and feet in the air. Another unusual effect. Heavy clouds passed above us, forming and fading swiftly. But after thinking it over, I realized that these so-called clouds were caused simply by the changing densities of the long ground swells, and I even spotted the foaming whitecaps that their breaking crests were proliferating over the surface of the water. Lastly, I couldn't help seeing the actual shadows of large birds passing over our heads, swiftly skimming the surface of the sea. On this occasion, I witnessed one of the finest gunshots ever to thrill the marrow of a hunter. A large bird with a wide wingspan, quite clearly visible, approached and hovered over us. When it was just a few meters above the waves, Captain Nemo's companion took aim and fired. The animal dropped, electrocuted, and its descent brought it within reach of our adroit hunter, who promptly took possession of it. It was an albatross of the finest species, a wonderful specimen of these open-sea fowl. This incident did not interrupt our walk. For 2 hours we were sometimes led over plains of sand, sometimes over prairies of seaweed that were quite arduous to cross. In all honesty, I was dead tired by the time I spotted a hazy glow half a mile away, cutting through the darkness of the waters. It was the Nautilus's beacon. Within 20 minutes we would be on board, and there I could breathe easy again, because my tank's current air supply seemed to be quite low in oxygen. But I was reckoning without an encounter that slightly delayed our arrival. I was lagging behind some 20 paces when I saw Captain Nemo suddenly come back toward me. With his powerful hands, he sent me buckling to the ground, while his companion did the same to Conseil. At first I didn't know what to make of this sudden assault, but I was reassured to observe the captain lying motionless beside me. I was stretched out on the seafloor directly beneath some bushes of algae, when I raised my head and spied 2 enormous masses hurtling by, throwing off phosphorescent glimmers. My blood turned cold in my veins. I saw that we were under threat from a fearsome pair of sharks. They were blue sharks, dreadful man-eaters with enormous tails, dull, glassy stares, and phosphorescent matter oozing from holes around their snouts. They were like monstrous fireflies that could thoroughly pulverize a man in their iron jaws. I don't know if Conseil was busy with their classification, but as for me, I looked at their silver bellies, their fearsome mouths bristling with teeth, from a viewpoint less than scientific, more as a victim than as a professor of natural history. Luckily, these voracious animals have poor eyesight. They went by without noticing us, grazing us with their brownish fins, and miraculously, we escaped a danger greater than encountering a tiger deep in the jungle. Half an hour later, guided by its electric trail, we reached the Nautilus. The outside door had been left open, and Captain Nemo closed it after we re-entered the first cell. Then he pressed a button. I heard pumps operating within the ship. I felt the water lowering around me, and in a few moments the cell was completely empty. The inside door opened, and we passed into the wardrobe. There, our diving suits were removed, not without difficulty, and utterly exhausted, faint from lack of food and rest, I repaired to my stateroom, full of wonder at this startling excursion on the bottom of the sea. End of chapter 17. Recording by Liz Morant. lizmorant@gmail.com.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 18. 4,000 Leagues Under the Pacific. By the next morning, November the 18th, I was fully recovered from my exhaustion of the day before, and I climbed onto the platform just as the Nautilus chief officer was pronouncing his daily phrase. It then occurred to me that these words either referred to the state of the sea or that they meant there's nothing inside. And in truth, the ocean was deserted. Not a sail on the horizon. The tips of Crespo Island had disappeared during the night, the sea, absorbing every colour of the prism except its blue rays, reflected the latter in every direction and sported a wonderful indigo tint. The undulating waves regularly took on the appearance of watered silk with wide stripes. I was marvelling at this magnificent ocean view when Captain Nemo appeared. He didn't seem to notice my presence and began a series of astronomical observations. Then, his operations finished, he went and leaned his elbow on the beacon housing, his eyes straying over the surface of the ocean. Meanwhile, some 20 of the Nautilus sailors, all energetic, well-built fellows, climbed onto the platform. They had come to pull up the nets left in our wake during the night. These seamen obviously belonged to different nationalities, although indications of European physical traits could be seen in them all. If I'm not mistaken, I recognized some Irishmen, some Frenchmen, and a few Slavs, and a native of either Greece or Crete. Even so, these men were frugal of speech, and used among themselves only that bizarre dialect whose origin I couldn't even guess, so I had to give up any notions of questioning them. The nets were hauled on board. They were a breed of trawl resembling those used off the Normandy coast. Huge pouches held half open by a floating pole, and a chain laced through the lower meshes. Trailing in this way from these iron glove makers, the resulting receptacles scoured the ocean floor and collected every marine exhibit in their path. That day, they gathered up some unusual specimens from these fish-filled waterways. Anglerfish whose comical movements qualify them for the epithet clowns, black Commerson anglers equipped with their antennas, undulating triggerfish encircled by little red bands, bloated puffers whose venom is extremely insidious, some olive-hued lampreys, snipefish covered with silver scales, cutlass fish whose electrocuting power equals that of the electric eel and the electric ray, scaly featherbacks with brown crosswire bands, greenish codfish, several varieties of goby, etc. Finally, some fish of larger proportions, a 1-meter jack with a prominent head, several fine bonito from the genus Scumber decked out in the colours blue and silver, and 3 magnificent tuna whose high speeds couldn't save them from all trawl. I estimate that the cast of the net brought in more than 1,000 pounds of fish. It was a fine catch, but not surprising. In essence, these nets stayed in our wake for several hours, incarcerating an entire aquatic world in prisons made of thread. So we were never lacking in provisions of the highest quality, which the Nautilus' speed and the lure of its electric light could continually replenish. These various exhibits from the sea were immediately lowered down the hatch in the direction of the storage lockers, some to be eaten fresh, others to be preserved. After its fishing was finished and its air supply renewed, I thought the Nautilus would resume its underwater excursion, and I was getting ready to return to my stateroom when Captain Nemo turned to me and said without further preamble, "Look at this ocean, Professor. Doesn't it have the actual gift of life? Doesn't it experience both anger and affection? Last evening it went to sleep, just as we did, and there it is, waking up after a peaceful night." No hellos or good mornings for this gent. You would have thought that this eccentric individual was simply continuing a conversation we'd already started. "See," he went on, "it's waking up under the sun caresses. It's going to relieve its daily existence. What a fascinating field of study lies in watching the play of its organisms. It owns a pulse and arteries, it has spasms, and I side with the scholarly Commander Moray, who discovered that it has circulation as real as the circulation of blood in animals. I'm sure that Captain Nemo expected no replies from me, and it seemed pointless to pitch in with, "Ah, yes, exactly," or "How right you are." Rather, he was simply talking to himself, with long pauses between sentences. He was meditating out loud. "Yes," he said, "the ocean owns a genuine circulation, and to start it going, the Creator of all things has only to increase its heat, salt, and microscopic animal life. In essence, heat creates the different densities that leads to currents and countercurrents. Evaporation, which is nil in the high Arctic regions and very active in the equatorial zones, brings about a constant interchange of tropical and polar waters. What's more, I've detected those falling and rising currents that makes up the ocean's true breathing. I've seen a molecule of salt water heat up at the surface, sink into the depths, reach maximum density at -2 centigrade, then cool off, grow lighter and rise again. At the poles you will see the consequences of this phenomenon, and through this law of far-seen nature you'll understand why water can freeze only at the surface. As the captain was finishing his sentence, I said to myself, "The pole? Is this brazen individual claiming he'll take us even to that location?" Meanwhile, the captain fell silent and stared at the element he had studied so thoroughly and unceasingly. Then, going on, "Salts," he said, "fill the sea in considerable quantities, Professor. And if you removed all its dissolved saline content, you'd create a mass measuring 4,500,000 cubic leagues, which, if it were spread all over the globe, would form a layer more than 10 meters high. And don't think that the presence of these salts is due merely to some whim of nature. No, they make ocean water less open to evaporation and prevent winds from carrying off excessive amounts of steam, which, when condensing, would submerge the temperate zones. Salts play a leading role, the role of stabilizer for the general ecology of the globe." Captain Nemo stopped, straightened up, took a few steps along the platform, and returned to me. "As for those billions of tiny animals," he went on, "those infusoria that live by the millions in one droplet of water, 800,000 of which are needed to weigh 1 milligram, their role is no less important. They absorb the marine salts, they assimilate the solid elements in the water, and since they create coral and madrepores, they're the true builders of limestone continents. And so, after they've finished depriving our water drops of its mineral nutrients, the droplets gets lighter, rises to the surface, there absorbs more salt left behind through evaporation, gets heavier, sinks again, and brings those tiny animals new elements to absorb. The outcome, a double current rising and falling, constant movement, constant life, more intense than on land, more abundant, more infinite. Such life blooms in every part of this ocean, an element fatal to man, they say, but vital to myriads of animals and to me." When Captain Nemo spoke in this way, he was transfigured, and he filled me with extraordinary excitement. "There," he added, "out there lies true existence, and I can imagine the founding of nautical towns, clusters of underwater households that, like the Nautilus, would return to the surface of the sea to breathe each morning. Free towns, if ever there were, independent cities. Then again, who knows whether some tyrant. Captain Nemo finished his sentence with a vehement gesture. Then, addressing me directly, as if to drive away an ugly thought, "Professor Aronnax," he asked me, "do you know the depths of the ocean floor?" "At least, Captain, I know what the major surrounding tells us." "Could you quote them to me, so I can double-check them as the need arises?" "Here," I replied, "are a few of them that sticks to my memory. If I'm not mistaken, an average depth of 8,200 meters was found in the North Atlantic, and 2,500 meters in the Mediterranean. The most remarkable surroundings were taken in the South Atlantic, near the 35th parallel, and they gave 12,000 meters, 14,091 meters, and 15,149 meters. All in all, it's estimated that if the sea bottom were made level, its average depth would be about 7 kilometers." "Well, Professor," Captain Nemo replied, "we'll show you better than that, I hope. As for the average depth of this part of the Pacific, I'll inform you that it's a mere 4,000 meters." This said, Captain Nemo headed to the hatch and disappeared down the ladder. I followed him and went back to the main lounge. The propeller was instantly set in motion, and the log gave our speed as 20 miles per hour. Over the ensuing days and weeks, Captain Nemo was very frugal with his visits. I saw him only at rare intervals. His chief officer regularly fixed the positions I found reported on the chart, and in such a way that I could exactly plot the Nautilus course. Conseil had told his friend about the wonders of our undersea stroll, and the Canadian was sorry he hadn't gone along. But I hoped an opportunity would arise for a visit to the forest of Oceania. Almost every day, the panels in the lounge were open for some hours, and our eyes never tired of probing the mysteries of the underwater world. The Nautilus' general heading was southeast, and it stayed at a depth between 100 and 150 meters. However, from Lord knows what whim, one day it did a diagonal dive by means of its slanting fins, reaching strata located 2,000 meters underwater. The thermometer indicated a temperature of 4.25 centigrade, which at this depth seemed to be a temperature common to all latitudes. On November the 26th, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Nautilus cleared the Tropic of Cancer at longitude 172 degrees. On the 27th, it passed in sight of the Hawaiian Islands, where the famous Captain Cook met his death on February the 14th, 1779. By then, we had fared 4,860 leagues from our starting point. When I arrived on the platform that morning, I saw the islands of Hawaii 2 miles leeward, the largest of the 7 islands making up this group. I could clearly distinguish the tilled soils on its outskirts, the various mountain chains running parallel with its coastline, and its volcanoes crowned by Mauna Kea, whose elevation is 5,000 meters above sea level. Among other specimens from these waterways, our nets brought up some peacock-tailed flabellarian coral, polyps flattened into stylish shapes and unique to this part of the ocean. The Nautilus kept to its southeasterly heading. On December the 1st, it cut the equator at longitude 142 degrees, and on the 4th of the same month, after a quick crossing marked by no incident, we raised the Marquesas Islands. 3 miles off, in latitude 8 degrees 57 south and longitude 139 degrees 32 west, I spotted Martin Point on Nuku Hiva, chief member of this island group that belongs to France. I could make out only its wooden mountains on the horizon because Captain Nemo hated to hug shore. There our nets brought up some fine fish samples. Dolphin fish with azure fins, gold tails, and flesh that's unrivaled in the entire world, genus Oligonus. They were nearly denuded of scales but exquisite in flavour. Knife jaws with bony beaks, yellowish albacore that were as tasty as bonito. All fish worth classifying in the ship's pantry. After leaving these delightful islands, to the protection of the French flag, the Nautilus covered about 2,000 miles from December the 4th to the 11th. Its navigating was marked by an encounter with an immersed school of squid, unusual mollusks that are near neighbours of the cuttlefish. French fishermen give them the name cocklefish, and they belong to the class Cephalopoda, family Dibranchiata, consisting of themselves together with cuttlefish and argonauts. The naturalists of antiquity made a special study of them, and these animals furnished many ribald figures of speech for soapbox orators, as well as excellent dishes for the tables of rich citizens. If we're to believe Athenaeus, a Greek physician predating Galen, it was during the night of December the 9th to the 10th that a Nautilus encountered this army of distinctly nocturnal mollusks. They numbered in the millions. They were migrating from the temperate zones towards the zones still warmer, following the itineraries of herring and sardines. We stared at them through our thick glass windows. They swam backward with tremendous speed, moving by means of their locomotive tubes, chasing fish and mollusks, eating the little ones eaten by the big ones, and tossing in indescribable confusion the 10 feet that nature has rooted in their heads like a hairpiece of pneumatic snakes. Despite its speed, the Nautilus navigated for several hours in the midst of this school of animals, and its net brought up an incalculable number, among which I recognized all 9 species that Professor Aubigny has classified as native to the Pacific Ocean. During this crossing, the sea continually lavished us with the most marvellous sights. Its variety was infinite. It changed its setting and decor for the mere pleasure of our eyes, and we were called upon not simply to contemplate the works of our Creator in the midst of the liquid element, but also to probe the ocean's most daunting mysteries. During the day of December the 11th, I was busy reading in the main lounge. Ned Land and Conseil were observing the luminous waters through the gaping panels. The Nautilus was motionless, its ballast tank full. It was sitting at a depth of 1,000 meters in a comparatively unpopulated region of the ocean, where only larger fish put in occasional appearance. Just then I was studying a delightful book by Jean Mazet, The Servants of the Stomach, and savouring its ingenious teachings, when Conseil interrupted my reading. "Would master kindly come here for an instant?" he said to me in an odd voice.
"What is it, Conseil?"
"It's something that master should see." I stood up, went, leaned on my elbows before the window, and I saw it. In the broad electric daylight, an enormous black mass, quite motionless, hung suspended in the midst of the waters. I absorbed it carefully, trying to find out the nature of this gigantic cetacean. Then a sudden thought crossed my mind. "A ship!" I exclaimed. "Yes," the Canadian replied. "A disabled craft that's sinking straight down." Ned Land was not mistaken. We were in the presence of a ship whose severed shrouds still hung from their clasps. Its hull looked in good condition, and it must have gone under only a few hours before. The stumps of 3 masts, chopped off 2 feet above the deck, indicated a flooding ship that had been forced to sacrifice its masting. But it had heeled sideways, filling completely, and it was listing to port even yet. A sorry sight, this carcass lost under the waves, but sorry still was the sight on its deck, where lashed with ropes to prevent their being washed overboard, some human corpses still lay. I counted 4 of them, 4 men. One still standing at the helm, then a woman, halfway out of the skylight on the afterdeck, holding a child in arms. This woman was young. Under the brilliant light of the Nautilus rays, I could make out her features, which the water hadn't yet decomposed. With a supreme effort, she had lifted her child above her head, and the poor little creature's arms were still twined around its mother's neck. The posture of the 4 seamen seemed ghastly to me, twisted from convulsive movements, as if making a last effort to break loose from the ropes that bound them to the ship. And the helmsman, standing alone, calmer, his face smooth and serious, his grizzled hair plastered to his brow, his hands clutching the wheel, seemed even yet to be guiding his wrecked 3-master through the ocean depths. What a scene! We stood dumbstruck, hearts pounding, before this shipwreck caught in the act, as if it had been photographed in its final moments, so to speak. And already I could see enormous sharks moving in, eyes ablaze, drawn by the lure of human flesh. Meanwhile, turning, the Nautilus made a circle around the sinking ship, and for an instant I could read the board on its stern. The Florida, Sunderland, England. End of chapter 18. Recording by Eli Marie Hoftenkvesta.
Montreal, Canada. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 19. Vanikoro. This dreadful sight was the first of a whole series of maritime catastrophes that the Nautilus would encounter on its run. When it plied more heavily traveled seas, we often saw wrecked hulls rotting in mid-water, and farther down, cannons, shells, anchors, chains, and 1,000 other iron objects rusting away. Meanwhile, continuously swept along by the Nautilus, where we lived in near isolation, we raised the Tuamotu Islands on December 11, that old dangerous group associated with the French global navigator Commander Bougainville. It stretches from Ducie Island to Lazarus Island over an area of 500 leagues from the east-southeast to the west-northwest. Between latitude 13 degrees 30 minutes and 23 degrees 50 minutes south, and between longitude 125 degrees 30 minutes and 151 degrees 30 minutes west. This island group covers a surface area of 370 square leagues, and it's made up of some 60 subgroups, among which we noted the Gambier group, which is a French protectorate. These islands are coral formations. Thanks to the work of polyps, a slow but steady upheaval will someday connect these islands to each other. Later on, this new island will be fused to its neighboring island groups, and a 5th continent will stretch from New Zealand and New Caledonia as far as the Marquesas Islands. The day I expounded this theory to Captain Nemo, he answered me coldly. "The Earth doesn't need new continents, but new men." Sailor's luck led the Nautilus straight to Rayo Island, one of the most unusual in this group, which was discovered in 1822 by Captain Bell aboard the Minerva. So I was able to study the madreporic process that has created the islands in this ocean. Madrepores, which one must guard against confusing with precious coral, clothe their tissue in a limestone crust, and their variations in structure have led my famous mentor, Professor Milne Edwards, to classify them into 5 divisions. The tiny microscopic animals that secrete this polypary live by the billions in the depths of their cells. Their limestone deposits build up into rocks, reefs, islets, islands. In some places, they form atolls, a circular ring surrounding a lagoon or small inner lake that gaps place in contact with the sea. Elsewhere, they take the shape of barrier reefs, such as those that exist along the coast of New Caledonia and several of the Tuamotu Islands. In still other localities, such as Reunion Island and the island of Mauritius, they build fringing reefs, high straight walls next to which the ocean's depth is considerable. While cruising along only a few cable lengths from the underpining of Rayo Island, I marveled at the gigantic piece of work accomplished by these microscopic laborers. These walls were the express achievements of madrepores, known by the names fire coral, finger coral, star coral, and stony coral. These polyps grow exclusively in the agitated strata at the surface of the sea, and so it's in the upper reaches that they begin these substructures, which sink little by little together with the secreted rubble binding them. This, at least, is the theory of Mr. Charles Darwin, who thus explains the formation of atolls. A theory superior, in my view, to the one that says these madreporic edifices sit on the summits of mountains or volcanoes submerged a few feet below sea level. I could observe these strange walls quite closely. Our sounding lines indicated that they dropped perpendicularly for more than 300 meters, and our electric beams made the bright limestone positively sparkle. In reply to a question Conseil asked me about the growth rate of these colossal barriers, I thoroughly amazed him by saying that scientists put it at 1/8 of an inch per biennium. Therefore, he said to me, to build these walls it took 192,000 years, my gallant Conseil, which significantly extends the biblical days of creation. What's more, the formation of coal, in other words, the petrification of forests swallowed by floods, and the cooling of basaltic rocks likewise call for a much longer period of time. I might add that those days in the Bible must represent whole epochs, and not literally the lapse of time between two sunrises, because according to the Bible itself, the sun doesn't date from the first day of creation. When the Nautilus returned to the surface of the ocean, I could take in Rayo Island over its whole flat, wooded expanse. Obviously, its madreporic rocks had been made fertile by tornadoes and thunderstorms. One day, carried off by a hurricane from neighboring shores, some seed fell onto these limestone beds, mixing with decomposed particles of fish and marine plants to form vegetable humus. Propelled by the waves, a coconut arrived on this new coast. Its germ took root, its tree grew tall, catching steam off the water. A brook was born. Little by little, vegetation spread. Tiny animals, worms, insects, rode ashore on tree trunks snatched from islands to windward. Turtles came to lay their eggs, birds nested in the young trees. In this way, animal life developed, and drawn by the greenery and fertile soil, man appeared. And that's how these islands were formed, the immense achievement of microscopic animals. Near evening, Rayo Island melted into the distance, and the Nautilus noticeably changed course. After touching the Tropic of Capricorn at longitude 135 degrees, it headed west-northwest, going back up the whole intertropical zone. Although the summer sun lavished its rays on us, we never suffered from the heat, because 30 or 40 meters underwater, the temperature didn't go over 10 degrees to 12 degrees centigrade. By December 15, we had left the alluring Society Islands in the west, likewise elegant Tahiti, Queen of the Pacific. In the morning I spotted this island's lofty summits a few miles to leeward. Its waters supplied excellent fish for the tables on board, mackerel, bonito, albacore, and a few varieties of that sea serpent named the moray eel. The Nautilus had cleared 8,100 miles. We logged 9,720 miles when we passed between the Tonga Islands, where crews from the Argo, Port-au-Prince, and Duke of Portland had perished, and the island group of Samoa, scene of the slaying of Captain de Langle, friend of that long-lost navigator, the Count de la Pérouse. Then we raised the Fiji Islands, where savages slaughtered sailors from the Union, as well as Captain Bureau, commander of the Darling Josephine, out of Nantes, France. Extending over an expanse of 100 leagues north to south, and over 90 leagues east to west, this island group lies between latitude 2 degrees and 6 degrees south, and between longitude 174 degrees and 179 degrees west. It consists of a number of islands, islets, and reefs, among which we noted the islands of Viti-Levu, Vanuatu-Levu, and Kadavu. It was the Dutch navigator Tasman who discovered this group in 1643. The same year, the Italian physicist Torricelli invented the barometer, and King Louis XIV ascended the French throne. I'll let the reader decide which of these deeds was more beneficial to humanity. Coming later, Captain Cook in 1774, Rear Admiral d'Entrecasteaux in 1793, and finally Captain Dumont d'Urville in 1827 untangled the whole chaotic geography of this island group. The Nautilus drew near Wailea Bay, an unlucky place for England's Captain Dillon, who was the first to shed light on the long-standing mystery surrounding the disappearance of ships under the Count de la Pérouse. This bay, repeatedly dredged, furnished a huge supply of excellent oysters. As the Roman playwright Seneca recommended, we opened them right at our table, then stuffed ourselves. These mollusks belong to the species known by name as Ostrea lamellosa, whose members are quite common off Corsica. This Wailea oyster bank must have been extensive, and for certain, if they hadn't been controlled by numerous natural checks, these clusters of shellfish would have ended up jam-packing the bay, since as many as 2 million eggs have been counted in a single individual. And if Mr. Ned Land did not repent of his gluttony at our oyster fest, it's because oysters are the only dish that never causes indigestion. In fact, it takes no less than 16 dozen of these headless mollusks to supply the 315 grams that satisfy one man's minimum daily requirement for nitrogen. On December 25, the Nautilus navigated amid the island group of the New Hebrides, which the Portuguese seafarer Queiroz discovered in 1606, which Commander Bougainville explored in 1768, and to which Captain Cook gave its current name in 1773. This group is chiefly made up of 9 large islands and forms a 120-league strip from the north-northwest to the south-southeast, lying between latitude 2 degrees and 15 degrees south, and between longitude 164 degrees and 168 degrees. At the moment of our noon sights, we passed fairly close to the island of Arau, which looked to me like a mass of green woods crowned by a peak of great height. That day, it was Yuletide, and it struck me that Ned Land badly missed celebrating Christmas, that genuine family holiday where Protestants are such zealots. I hadn't seen Captain Nemo for over a week when, on the morning of the 27th, he entered the main lounge, as usual, acting as if he'd been gone for just 5 minutes. I was busy tracing the Nautilus's course on the world map. The captain approached, placed a finger over a position on the chart, and pronounced just one word. Vanikoro. This name was magic. It was the name of those islets where vessels under the Count de la Pérouse had miscarried. I straightened suddenly. "The Nautilus is bringing us to Vanikoro?" I asked. "Yes, Professor," the captain replied. "And I'll be able to visit those famous islands where the compass and the astrolabe came to grief?" "If you like, Professor." "When will we reach Vanikoro?" "We already have, Professor." Followed by Captain Nemo, I climbed onto the platform, and from there my eyes eagerly scanned the horizon. In the northeast, there emerged 2 volcanic islands of unequal size, surrounded by a coral reef whose circuit measured 40 miles. We were facing the island of Vanikoro proper, to which Captain Dumont d'Urville had given the name Island of the Search. We lay right in front of the little harbor of Vana, located in latitude 16 degrees 4 minutes south and longitude 164 degrees 32 minutes east. Its shores seemed covered with greenery, from its beaches to its summits inland, crowned by Mount Kapogo, which is 476 fathoms high. After clearing the outer belt of rocks via a narrow passageway, the Nautilus lay inside the breakers where the sea had a depth of 30 to 40 fathoms. Under the green shade of some tropical evergreens, I spotted a few savages who looked extremely startled at our approach. In this long blackish object advancing flush with the water, didn't they see some fearsome cetacean that they were obliged to view with distrust? Just then, Captain Nemo asked me what I knew about the shipwreck of the Count de la Pérouse. "What everybody knows, Captain," I answered him. "And could you kindly tell me what everybody knows?" he asked me in a gently ironic tone. "Very easily." I related to him what the final deeds of Captain Dumont d'Urville had brought to light, deeds described here in this heavily condensed summary of the whole matter. In 1785, the Count de la Pérouse and his subordinate, Captain de Langle, were sent by King Louis XVI of France on a voyage to circumnavigate the globe. They boarded 2 sloops of war, the Compass and the Astrolabe, which were never seen again. In 1791, justly concerned about the fate of these 2 sloops of war, the French government fitted out 2 large cargo boats, the Search and the Hope, which left Brest on September 28th under orders from Rear Admiral Bruni d'Entrecasteaux. 2 months later, testimony from a certain Commander Bowen aboard the Albemarle alleged that rubble from shipwrecked vessels had been seen on the coast of New Georgia. But d'Entrecasteaux was unaware of this news, which seemed a bit dubious anyhow, and headed towards the Admiralty Islands, which had been named in a report by one Captain Hunter as the site of the Count de la Pérouse's shipwreck. They looked in vain. The Hope and the Search passed right by Vanikoro without stopping there, and overall this voyage was plagued by misfortune, ultimately costing the lives of Rear Admiral d'Entrecasteaux, 2 of his subordinate officers, and several seamen from his crew. It was an old hand at the Pacific, the English adventurer Captain Peter Dillon, who was the first to pick up the trail left by castaways from the wrecked vessels. On May 15, 1824, his ship, the St. Patrick, passed by Tikopia Island, one of the New Hebrides. There, a native boatman pulled alongside in a dugout canoe and sold Dillon a silver sword hilt bearing the imprint of characters engraved with a cutting tool known as a burin. Furthermore, this native boatman claimed that during a stay in Vanikoro 6 years earlier, he had seen 2 Europeans belonging to ships that had run aground on the island's reefs many years before. Dillon guessed that the ships at issue were those under the Count de la Pérouse, ships whose disappearance had shaken the entire world. He tried to reach Vanikoro, where, according to the native boatman, a good deal of rubble from the shipwreck could still be found, but winds and currents prevented his doing so. Dillon returned to Calcutta. There he was able to interest the Asiatic Society and the East India Company in his discovery. A ship named after the Search was placed at his disposal, and he departed January 23, 1827, accompanied by a French deputy. This new Search, after putting in at several stops over the Pacific, dropped anchor before Vanikoro on July 7, 1827, in the same harbor of Vana where the Nautilus was currently floating. There Dillon collected many relics of the shipwreck, iron utensils, anchors, eyelets from pulleys, swivel guns, an 18-pound shell, the remains of some astronomical instruments, a piece of stern rail, and a bronze bell bearing the inscription, "Made by Bazin," the foundry mark at Brest Arsenal around 1785. There could no longer be any doubt. Finishing his investigations, Dillon stayed at the site of the casualty until the month of October. Then he left Vanikoro, headed toward New Zealand, dropped anchor at Calcutta on April 7, 1828, and returned to France, where he received a very cordial welcome from King Charles X. But just then, the renowned French explorer Captain Dumont d'Urville, unaware of Dillon's activities, had already set sail to search elsewhere for the site of the shipwreck. In essence, a whaling vessel had reported that some medals and a cross of St. Louis had been found in the hands of savages in the Louisiade Islands and New Caledonia. So Captain Dumont d'Urville had put to sea in command of a vessel named after the Astrolabe, and just 2 months after Dillon had left Vanikoro, Dumont d'Urville dropped anchor before Hobart. There he heard about Dillon's findings, and he further learned that a certain James Hobbs, chief officer on the Union out of Calcutta, had put to shore on an island located in latitude 8 degrees 18 minutes south and longitude 156 degrees 30 minutes east, and had noted the natives of those waterways making use of iron bars and red fabrics. Pretty perplexed, Dumont d'Urville didn't know if he should give credence to these reports, which had been carried in some of the less reliable newspapers. Nevertheless, he decided to start on Dillon's trail. On February 10, 1828, the new Astrolabe hove before Tikopia Island, took on a guide and interpreter in the person of a deserter who had settled there, plied a course towards Vanikoro, raised it on February 12, sailed along its reefs until the 14th, and only on the 20th dropped anchor inside its barrier in the harbor of Vana. On the 23rd, several officers circled the island and brought back some rubble of little importance. The natives, adopting a system of denial and evasion, refused to guide them to the site of the casualty. This rather shady conduct aroused the suspicion that the natives had mistreated the castaways, and in truth, the natives seemed afraid that Dumont d'Urville had come to avenge the Count de la Pérouse and his unfortunate companions. But on the 26th, appeased with gifts, and seeing that they didn't need to fear any reprisals, the natives led the chief officer, Mr. Jacquinot, to the site of the shipwreck. At this location, in 3 or 4 fathoms of water between the Pau and Vana reefs, there lay some anchors, cannons, and ingots of iron and lead, all caked with limestone concretions. A launch and whaleboat from the new Astrolabe were steered to this locality, and after going to exhausting lengths, their crews managed to dredge up an anchor weighing 1,800 pounds, a cast iron 8-pounder cannon, a lead ingot, and 2 copper swivel guns. Questioning the natives, Captain Dumont d'Urville also learned that after La Pérouse's 2 ships had miscarried on the island's reefs, the Count had built a smaller craft, only to go off and miscarry a second time. Where? Nobody knew. The commander of the new Astrolabe then had a monument erected under a tuft of mangrove in memory of the famous navigator and his companions. It was a simple quadrangular pyramid set on a coral base with no ironwork to tempt the natives' avarice. Then Dumont d'Urville tried to depart, but his crews were run down from the fevers raging on these unsanitary shores, and quite ill himself, he was unable to weigh anchor until March 17. Meanwhile, fearing that Dumont d'Urville wasn't abreast of Dillon's activities, the French government sent a sloop of war to Vanikoro, the Bayonnaise under Commander Legourant de Tromelin, who had been stationed on the American west coast. Dropping anchor before Vanikoro a few months after the new Astrolabe's departure, the Bayonnaise didn't find any additional evidence, but verified that the savages hadn't disturbed the memorial honoring the Count de la Pérouse. This is the substance of the account I gave Captain Nemo. "So," he said to me, "the castaways built a 3rd ship on Vanikoro Island, and to this day nobody knows where it went and perished?" "Nobody knows." Captain Nemo didn't reply, but signaled me to follow him to the main lounge. The Nautilus sank a few meters beneath the waves, and the panels opened. I rushed to the window and saw crusts of coral, fungus coral, Siphanula coral, Alcyon coral, sea anemone from the genus Carophilia, plus myriads of charming fish including greenfish, damselfish, sweepers, snappers, and squirrelfish. Underneath this coral covering, I detected some rubble the old dredges hadn't been able to tear free: iron stirrups, anchors, cannons, shells, tackle from a capstan, a stem post, all objects hailing from the wrecked ships and now carpeted in moving flowers. And as I stared at this desolate wreckage, Captain Nemo told me in a solemn voice, "Commander La Pérouse set out on December 7th, 1785, with his ship, the Compass, and the Astrolabe. He dropped anchor first at Botany Bay, visited the Tonga Islands in New Caledonia, headed towards the Santa Cruz Islands, and put in at Nomuka, one of the islands in the Ha'apai group. Then his ships arrived at the unknown reefs of Vanikoro. Traveling in the lead, the Compass ran afoul of breakers on the southerly coast. The Astrolabe went to its rescue and also ran aground. The first ship was destroyed almost immediately. The second, stranded to leeward, held up for some days. The natives gave the castaways a fair enough welcome. The latter took up residence on the island and built a smaller craft with rubble from the 2 larger ones. A few seamen stayed voluntarily in Vanikoro. The others, weak and ailing, set sail with the Count de la Pérouse. They headed to the Solomon Islands, and they perished with all hands on the westerly coast of the chief island in that group, between Cape Deception and Cape Satisfaction." "And how do you know all this?" I exclaimed. "Here's what I found at the very site of that final shipwreck." Captain Nemo showed me a tin box, stamped with the coat of arms of France and all corroded by salt water. He opened it, and I saw a bundle of papers, yellowed but still legible. They were the actual military orders given by France's Minister of the Navy to Commander La Pérouse, with notes along the margin in the handwriting of King Louis XVI. "Ah, what splendid death for a seaman!" Captain Nemo then said. "A coral grave is a tranquil grave, and may heaven grant that my companions and I rest in no other." End of chapter 19. Recorded by Jen Jones, Montreal, Canada.
Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 20. The Torres Strait. During the night of December 27 to 28, the Nautilus left the waterways of Vanikoro behind with extraordinary speed. Its heading was southwesterly, and in 3 days it had cleared the 750 leagues that separated La Pérouse's islands from the southeastern tip of Papua. On January 1st, 1868, bright and early, Conseil joined me on the platform. "Will master," the gallant lad said to me, "allow me to wish him a happy New Year?" "Good heavens, Conseil! It's just like old times in my office at the Botanical Gardens in Paris. I accept your kind wishes, and I thank you for them. Only, I'd like to know what you mean by a happy year under the circumstances in which we're placed. Is it a year that will bring our imprisonment to an end, or a year that will see this strange voyage continue?" "Ye gods!" Conseil replied, "I hardly know what to tell master. We're certainly seeing some unusual things, and for 2 months we've had no time for boredom. The latest wonder is always the most astonishing, and if this progression keeps up, I can't imagine what its climax will be. In my opinion, we'll never again have such an opportunity. Never, Conseil. Besides, Mr. Nemo really lives up to his Latin name, since he couldn't be less in the way if he didn't exist." "True enough, Conseil." "Therefore, with all due respect to master, I think a happy year would be a year that lets us see everything." "Everything, Conseil? No year could be that long. But what does Ned Land think about all this?" "Ned Land's thoughts are exactly the opposite of mine," Conseil replied. "He has a practical mind and a demanding stomach. He's tired of staring at fish and eating them day in and day out. This shortage of wine, bread, and meat isn't suitable for an upstanding Anglo-Saxon, a man accustomed to beefsteak and unfazed by regular doses of brandy or gin. For my part, Conseil, that doesn't bother me in the least, and I've adjusted very nicely to the diet on board." "So have I," Conseil replied. "Accordingly, I think as much about staying as Mr. Land about making his escape. Thus, if this new year isn't a happy one for me, it will be for him, and vice versa. No matter what happens, one of us will be pleased. So, in conclusion, I wish master to have whatever his heart desires." "Thank you, Conseil. Only I must ask you to postpone the question of New Year's gifts, and temporarily accept a hearty handshake in their place. That's all I have on me." "Master has never been more generous," Conseil replied. And with that, the gallant lad went away. By January 2nd, we had fared 11,340 miles, hence 5,250 leagues, from our starting point in the seas of Japan. Before the Nautilus's spur there stretched the dangerous waterways of the Coral Sea, off the northeast coast of Australia. Our boat cruised along a few miles away from that daunting shoal, where Captain Cook's ships well nigh miscarried on June 10th, 1770. The craft that Cook was aboard charged into some coral rock, and if his vessel didn't go down, it was thanks to the circumstance that a piece of coral broke off in the collision and plugged the very hole it had made in the hull. I would have been deeply interested in visiting this long 360-league reef, against which the ever-surging sea broke with the fearsome intensity of thunderclaps. But just then the Nautilus's slanting fins took us to great depths, and I could see nothing of those high coral walls. I had to rest content with the various specimens of fish brought up by our nets. Among others, I noted some long-finned albacore, a species in the genus Scober, as big as tuna, bluish on the flanks, and streaked with crosswise stripes that disappear when the animal dies. These fish followed us in schools and supplied our table with very dainty flesh. We also caught a large number of yellow-green gilthead, half a decimeter long and tasting like Dorado, plus some flying gurnards, authentic underwater swallows that, on dark nights, alternately streak air and water with their phosphorescent glimmers. Among mollusks and zoophytes, I found in our trawls meshes various species of alcanarian coral, sea urchins, hammer shells, spur star shells, wentletrap snails, horn shells, glass snails. The local flora was represented by fine floating algae, sea tangle and kelp from the genus Macrocristis, saturated with the mucilage their pores perspire, from which I selected a wonderful Nemostoma gentilonatoscoidea, classifying it with natural curiosities in the museum. On January 4th, 2 days after crossing the Coral Sea, we raised the coast of Papua. On this occasion, Captain Nemo told me that he intended to reach the Indian Ocean via the Torres Strait. This was the extent of his remarks. Ned saw with pleasure that this course would bring us, once again, closer to European seas. The Torres Strait is regarded as no less dangerous for its bristling reefs than for the savage inhabitants of its coasts. It separates Queensland from the huge island of Papua, also called New Guinea. Papua is 400 leagues long by 130 leagues wide, with a surface area of 40,000 geographic leagues. It's located between latitude 0 degrees 19 minutes and 10 degrees 2 minutes south, and between longitude 128 degrees 23 minutes and 146 degrees 15 minutes. At noon, while the chief officer was taking the sun's altitude, I spotted the summits of the Arfak Mountains, rising in terraces and ending in sharp peaks. Discovered in 1511 by the Portuguese Francisco Serrano, these shores were successfully visited by Don Jorge de Meneses in 1526, by Juan de Rilava in 1527, by the Spanish general Alvaro de Cervera in 1528, by Ino Ortez in 1545, by the Dutchman Schouten in 1616, by Nicholas Truick in 1753, by Tasman, Dampier, Fomel, Carteret, Edwards, Bougainville, Cook, McClure, and Thomas Forrest, by Rear Admiral de Nicastro in 1792, by Louis Isidore Dupré in 1823, and by Captain Dumont d'Urville in 1827. It's the heartland of the blacks who occupy all Malaysia, Mr. de Renzi has said, and I hadn't the foggiest inkling that sailor's luck was about to bring me face to face with these daunting Andaman aborigines. So the Nautilus hove before the entrance to the world's most dangerous strait, a passage that even the boldest navigators hesitated to clear. The strait that Louis Verne de Torres faced on returning from the South Seas and Melanesia. The strait in which sloops of war under Captain Dumont d'Urville ran aground in 1840 and nearly miscarried with all hands. And even the Nautilus, rising superior to every danger in the sea, was about to become intimate with its coral reefs. The Torres Strait is about 34 leagues wide, but it's obstructed by an incalculable number of islands, inlets, breakers, and rocks that make it nearly impossible to navigate. Consequently, Captain Nemo took every desired precaution in crossing it. Floating flush with the water, the Nautilus moved ahead at a moderate pace. Like a cetacean's tail, its propeller churned the waves slowly. Taking advantage of this situation, my two companions and I found seats in the ever-deserted platform. In front of us stood the pilot-house, and unless I'm extremely mistaken, Captain Nemo must have been inside, steering his Nautilus himself. Under my eyes I had the excellent charts of the Torres Strait that had been surveyed and drawn up by the hydrographic engineer Vincendon Dumoulin and Sub-Lieutenant, now Admiral, Couvent Dubois, who were part of Dumont d'Urville's general staff during his final voyage to circumnavigate the globe. These, along with the efforts of Captain King, are the best charts for untangling the snarl of this narrow passageway, and I consulted them with scrupulous care. Around the Nautilus, the sea was boiling furiously. A stream of waves, bearing from southeast to northwest at a speed of 2.5 miles per hour, broke over heads of coral emerging here and there. "That's one rough sea," Ned Land told me. "Abominable indeed," I replied, "and hardly suitable for a craft like the Nautilus." "That damned captain," the Canadian went on, "must really be sure of his course, because if these clumps of coral so much as brush us, they'll rip our hull into 1,000 pieces." The situation was indeed dangerous, but as if by magic the Nautilus seemed to glide right down the middle of these rampaging reefs. It didn't follow the exact course of the Zealous and the New Astrolabe, which had proved so ill-fated for Captain Dumont d'Urville. It went more to the north, hugged the Murray Islands, and returned to the southwest near Cumberland Passage. I thought it was about to charge wholeheartedly into this opening, but it went up to the northwest, through a large number of little-known islands and inlets, and steered toward Town Island and the Bad Channel. I was already wondering if Captain Nemo, rash to the point of sheer insanity, wanted his ship to tackle the Narrows where Dumont d'Urville's 2 sloops of war had gone aground, when he changed direction a second time and cut straight to the west, heading toward Gueboroa Island. By then it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The current was slacking off. It was almost full tide. The Nautilus drew near this island, which I can see to this day with its remarkable fringe of screw pines. We hugged it from less than 2 miles out. A sudden jolt threw me down. The Nautilus had just struck a reef, and it remained motionless, listing slightly to port. When I stood up, I saw Captain Nemo and his chief officer on the platform. They were examining the ship's circumstances, exchanging a few words in their incomprehensible dialect. Here is what those circumstances entailed. 2 miles to starboard lay Gueboroa Island, its coastline curving north to west like an immense arm. To the south and east, heads of coral were already on display, left uncovered by the ebbing waters. We had run aground at full tide, and in one of those seas whose tides are moderate, an inconvenient state of affairs for floating the Nautilus off. However, the ship hadn't suffered in any way, so solidly joined was its hull. But although it could neither sink nor split open, it was in serious danger of being permanently attached to these reefs, and that would have been the finish of Captain Nemo's submersible. I was mulling this over when the captain approached, cool and calm, forever in control of himself, looking neither alarmed nor annoyed. "An accident?" I said to him. "No, an incident," he answered me. "But an incident," I replied, "that may oblige you to become a resident again of these shores you avoid." Captain Nemo gave me an odd look and gestured no, which told me pretty clearly that nothing would ever force him to set foot on land mass again. Then he said, "No, Professor Aronnax, the Nautilus isn't consigned to perdition. It will still carry you through the midst of the ocean's wonders. Our voyage is just beginning, and I've no desire to deprive myself so soon of the pleasure of your company." "Even so, Captain Nemo," I went on, ignoring his ironic turn of phrase, "the Nautilus has run aground at a moment when the sea is full. Now then, the tides aren't strong in the Pacific, and if you can't unballast the Nautilus, which seems impossible to me, I don't see how it will float off." "You're right, Professor, the Pacific tides aren't strong," Captain Nemo replied. "But in the Torres Strait, one still finds a meter and a half difference in level between high and low seas. Today is January 4th, and in 5 days the moon will be full. Now then, I'll be quite astonished if that good-natured satellite doesn't sufficiently raise the masses of water and do me a favor for which I'll be forever grateful." That said, Captain Nemo went below again to the Nautilus's interior, followed by his chief officer. As for our craft, it no longer stirred, staying as motionless as if these coral polyps had already walled it in with their indestructible cement. "Well, sir?" Ned Land said to me, coming up after the captain's departure. "Well, Ned, my friend, we'll serenely wait for the tide on the 9th, because it seems the moon will have the good nature to float us away. As simple as that?" "As simple as that." "So our captain isn't going to drop his anchors, put his engines on the chains, and do anything to haul us off?" "Since the tide will be sufficient," Conseil replied simply. The Canadian stared at Conseil, then he shrugged his shoulders. The seaman in him was talking now. "Sir," he answered, "you can trust me when I say this hulk of iron will never navigate again, on the seas or under them. It's only fit to be sold for its weight. So I think it's time we gave Captain Nemo the slip." "Ned, my friend," I replied, "unlike you, I haven't given up on our valiant Nautilus, and in 4 days we'll know where we stand in these Pacific tides. Besides, an escape attempt might be timely if we were in sight of the coasts of England or Provence, but in the waterways of Papua it's another story, and we'll always have that as a last resort if the Nautilus doesn't right itself, which I'd regard as a real calamity." "But couldn't we at least get the lay of the land?" Ned went on. "There's an island. On this island there are trees. Under those trees, land animals, loaded with cutlets and roast beef, which I'd be happy to sink my teeth into." "In this instance, our friend Ned is right," Conseil said, "and I side with his views. Couldn't master persuade his friend Captain Nemo to send the 3 of us ashore, if only so our feet don't lose the knack of treading on the solid parts of our planet?" "I can ask him," I replied, "but he'll refuse." "Let master take the risk," Conseil said, "and we'll know where we stand on the captain's affability." Much to my surprise, Captain Nemo gave me the permission I asked for, and he did so with grace and alacrity, not even exacting my promise to return on board. But fleeing across the New Guinea territories would be extremely dangerous, and I wouldn't have advised Ned Land to try it. Better to be prisoners aboard the Nautilus than to fall into the hands of Papuan natives. The skiff was put at our disposal for the next morning. I hardly needed to ask whether Captain Nemo would be coming along. I likewise assumed that no crewman would be assigned to us, that Ned Land would be in sole charge of piloting the longboat. Besides, the shore lay no more than 2 miles off, and it would be child's play for the Canadian to guard that nimble skiff through these rows of reefs so ill-fated for big ships. The next day, January 5th, after its deck paneling was opened, the skiff was wrenched from its socket and launched to sea from the top of the platform. 2 men were sufficient for this operation. The oars were inside the longboat, and we had only to take our seats. At 8 o'clock, armed with rifles and axes, we pulled clear of the Nautilus. The sea was fairly calm. A mild breeze blew from shore. In place by the oars, Conseil and I rowed vigorously, and Ned steered us into the narrow lanes between the breakers. The skiff handled easily and sped swiftly. Ned Land couldn't conceal his glee. He was a prisoner escaping from prison, and never dreaming he would need to re-enter it. "Meat," he kept repeating. "Now we'll eat red meat, actual game, a real mess call, by thunder. I'm not saying fish aren't good for you, but we mustn't overdo 'em, and a slice of fresh venison grilled over live coals will be a nice change from our standard fare." "You glutton," Conseil replied, "you're making my mouth water." "It remains to be seen," I said, "whether these forests do contain game, and if the type of game isn't of such size that they can hunt the hunter." "Fine, Professor Aronnax," replied the Canadian, whose teeth seemed to be as honed as the edge of an axe. "But if there's no other quadruped on this island, I'll eat tiger sirloin." "Our friend Ned grows disturbing," Conseil replied. "Whatever it is," Ned Land went on, "any animal having 4 feet without feathers, or 2 feet with feathers, will be greeted by my very own one-gun salute." "Oh, good," I replied. "The reckless Mr. Land is at it again." "Don't worry, Professor Aronnax. Just keep rowing," the Canadian replied. "I only need 25 minutes to serve you one of my own special creations." By 8:30 the Nautilus's skiff had just run gently aground on a sandy strand, after successfully clearing the ring of coral that surrounds Gueboroa Island. End of chapter 20. Recording by Todd.
"20,000 Leagues Under the Sea" by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 21. Some Days Ashore. Stepping ashore had an exhilarating effect on me. Ned Land tested the soil with his foot as if he were laying claim to it. Yet it had been only 2 months since we had become, as Captain Nemo expressed it, passengers on the Nautilus. In other words, the literal prisoners of its commander. In a few minutes we were a gunshot away from the coast. The soil was almost entirely madreporic, but certain dry stream beds were strewn with granite rubble, proving that this island was of primordial origin. The entire horizon was hidden behind a curtain of wonderful forests. Enormous trees, sometimes as high as 200 feet, were linked to each other by garlands of tropical creepers, genuine natural hammocks that swayed in a mild breeze. There were mimosas, banyan trees, beefwood, teakwood, hibiscus, screw pines, palm trees, all mingling in wild profusion. And beneath the shade of their green canopies, at the feet of their gigantic trunks, there grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. Meanwhile, ignoring all these fine specimens of Papuan flora, the Canadian passed up the decorative in favor of the functional. He spotted a coconut palm, beat down some of its fruit, broke them open, and we drank their milk and ate their meat with a pleasure that was a protest against our standard fare on the Nautilus. "Excellent," Ned Land said. "Exquisite," Conseil replied. "And I don't think," the Canadian said, "that your Nemo would object to us stashing a cargo of coconuts aboard his vessel?" "I imagine not," I replied, "but he won't want to sample them." "Too bad for him," Conseil said. "And plenty good for us," Ned Land shot back. "There'll be more left over." "A word of caution, Mr. Land," I told the harpooner, who was about to ravage another coconut palm. "Coconuts are admirable things, but before we stuff the skiff with them, it would be wise to find out whether this island offers other substances just as useful. Some fresh vegetables would be well received in the Nautilus's pantry." "Master is right," Conseil replied, "and I propose that we set aside 3 places in our longboat, one for fruit, another for vegetables, and a third for venison, of which I still haven't glimpsed the tiniest specimen." "Don't give up so easily, Conseil," the Canadian replied. "So let's continue our excursion," I went on. "But keep a sharp lookout. This island seems uninhabited, but it still might harbor certain individuals who aren't so finicky about the sort of game they eat." "Hee hee," Ned put in, with a meaningful movement of his jaw. "Ned, oh horrors!" Conseil exclaimed. "Ye gods," the Canadian shot back. "I'm starting to appreciate the charms of cannibalism." "Ned, don't say that," Conseil answered. "You a cannibal? Why, I'll no longer be safe next to you, I who share your cabin. Does this mean I'll wake up half devoured one fine day?" "I'm awfully fond of you, Conseil, my friend, but not enough to eat you when there's better food around." "Then I daren't delay," Conseil replied. "The hunt is on. We absolutely must bag some game to placate this man-eater, or one of these mornings master won't find enough pieces of his manservant to serve him." While exchanging this chit-chat, we entered beneath the dark canopies of the forest, and for 2 hours we explored it in every direction. We couldn't have been luckier in our search for edible vegetation, and some of the most useful produce in the tropical zone supplied us with a valuable foodstuff missing on board. I mean the breadfruit tree, which is quite abundant on Gueboroa Island, and there I chiefly noted the seedless variety that in Malaysia is called rima. This tree is distinguished from other trees by a straight trunk 40 feet high. To the naturalist eye, its gracefully rounded crown, formed of big multi-lobed leaves, was enough to denote the artocarpus that has been so successfully transplanted to the Mascarene Islands east of Madagascar. From its mass of greenery, huge globular fruit stood out, a decimeter wide and furnished on the outside with creases that assumed a hexangular pattern. It's a handy plant that nature gives to regions lacking in wheat. Without needing to be cultivated, it bears fruit 8 months out of the year. Ned Land was on familiar terms with this fruit. He had already eaten it on his many voyages and knew how to cook its edible substance. So the very sight of it aroused his appetite, and he couldn't control himself. "Sir," he told me, "I'll die if I don't sample a little breadfruit pasta." "Sample some, Ned, my friend. Sample all you like. We're here to conduct experiments. Let's conduct them." "It won't take a minute," the Canadian replied. Equipped with a magnifying glass, he lit a fire of dead wood that was soon crackling merrily. Meanwhile, Conseil and I selected the finest artocarpus fruit. Some still weren't ripe enough, and their thick skins covered white, slightly fibrous pulps, but a great many others were yellowish and gelatinous, just begging to be picked. This fruit contained no pits. Conseil brought a dozen of them to Ned Land, who cut them into thick slices and placed them over a fire of live coals, all the while repeating, "You'll see, sir, how tasty this bread is. Especially since we've gone without baked goods for so long," Conseil said. "It's more than just bread," the Canadian added. "It's a dainty pastry. You've never eaten any, sir?" "No, Ned." "All right, get ready for something downright delectable. If you don't come back for seconds, I'm no longer the king of harpooners." After a few minutes, the parts of the fruit exposed to the fire were completely toasted. On the inside there appeared some white pasta, a sort of soft bread center whose flavor reminded me of artichoke. This bread was excellent, I must admit, and I ate it with great pleasure. "Unfortunately," I said, "this pasta won't stay fresh, so it seems pointless to make a supply for on board." "By thunder, sir," Ned Land exclaimed, "there you go, talking like a naturalist. But meantime, I'll be acting like a baker. Conseil, harvest some of this fruit to take with us when we go back." "And how will you prepare it?" I asked the Canadian. "I'll make a fermented batter from its pulp that'll keep indefinitely without spoiling. When I want some, I'll just cook it in the galley on board. It'll have a slightly tart flavor, but you'll find it excellent." "So, Mr. Ned, I see that this bread is all we need." "Not quite, Professor," the Canadian replied. "We need some fruit to go with it, or at least some vegetables." "Then let's look for fruit and vegetables." When our breadfruit harvesting was done, we took to the trail to complete this dry land dinner. We didn't search in vain, and near noontime we had an ample supply of bananas. This delicious produce from the torrid zones ripens all year round, and Malaysians, who give them the name pisang, eat them without bothering to cook them. In addition to bananas, we gathered some enormous jackfruit with a very tangy flavor, some tasty mangoes, and some pineapples of unbelievable size. But this foraging took up a good deal of our time, which, even so, we had no cause to regret. Conseil kept Ned under observation. The harpooner walked in the lead, and during his stroll through this forest, he gathered with sure hands some excellent fruit that should have completed his provisions. "So," Conseil asked, "you have everything you need, Ned, my friend?" The Canadian put in. "What, you're complaining?" "All this vegetation doesn't make a meal," Ned replied. "Just side dishes, dessert. But where's the soup course? Where's the roast?" "Right," I said. "Ned promised us cutlets, which seems highly questionable to me." "Sir," the Canadian replied, "our hunting not only isn't over, it hasn't even started. Patience! We're sure to end up bumping into some animal with either feathers or fur, if not in this locality, then in another. And if not today, then tomorrow, because we mustn't wander too far off," Conseil added. "That's why I propose that we return to the skiff." "What, already?" Ned exclaimed. "We ought to be back before nightfall," I said. "But what hour is it then?" the Canadian asked. 2 o'clock at least," Conseil replied. "How time flies on solid ground!" exclaimed Mr. Ned Land with a sigh of regret. "Off we go," Conseil replied. So we returned through the forest, and we completed our harvest by making a clean sweep of some palm cabbages that had to be picked from the crowns of their trees, some small beans that I recognized as the abrou of the Malaysians, and some high-quality yams. We were overloaded when we arrived at the skiff. However, Ned Land still found these provisions inadequate. But fortune smiled on him. Just as we were boarding, he spotted several trees 25 to 30 feet high, belonging to the palm species. As valuable as the Actocarpus, these trees are justly ranked among the most useful produce in Malaysia. They were sago palms, vegetation that grows without being cultivated. Like mulberry trees, they reproduce by means of shoots and seeds. Ned Land knew how to handle these trees. Taking his axe and wielding it with great vigor, he soon stretched out on the ground 2 or 3 sago palms, whose maturity was revealed by the white dust sprinkled over their palm fronds. He began by removing from each trunk an inch strip thick of bark that covered a network of long, hopelessly tangled fibers that were puttied with a sort of gummy flour. This flour was the starch-like sago, an edible substance chiefly consumed by the Melanesian peoples. For the time being, Ned Land was content to chop these trunks into pieces, as if he were making firewood. Later, he would extract the flour by sifting it through cloth to separate it from its fibrous ligaments, let it dry out in the sun, and leave it to harden inside molds. Finally, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, laden with all our treasures, we left the island beach and half an hour later pulled alongside the Nautilus. Nobody appeared on our arrival. The enormous sheet iron cylinder seemed deserted. Our provisions loaded on board, I went below to my stateroom. There I found my supper ready. I ate and then fell asleep. The next day, January 6th, nothing new on board. Not a sound inside, not a sign of life. The skiff stayed alongside in the same place we had left it. We decided to return to Gueboroa Island. Ned Land hoped for better luck in his hunting than on the day before, and he wanted to visit a different part of the forest. By sunrise, we were off. Carried by an inbound current, the longboat reached the island in a matter of moments. We disembarked, and thinking it best to abide by the Canadian's instincts, we followed Ned Land, whose long legs threatened to outpace us. Ned Land went westward up the coast, then, fording some stream beds, he reached open plains that were bordered by wonderful forests. Some kingfishers lurked along the watercourses, but they didn't let us approach. Their cautious behavior proved to me that these winged creatures knew where they stood on bipeds of our species, and I concluded that if this island wasn't inhabited, at least human beings paid it frequent visits. After crossing a pretty lush prairie, we arrived on the outskirts of a small wood, enlivened by the singing and soaring of a large number of birds. "Still, they're merely birds," Conseil said. "But some are edible," the harpooner replied. "Wrong, Ned, my friend," Conseil answered, "because I see only ordinary parrots here." "Conseil, my friend," Ned replied in all seriousness, "parrots are like pheasant to people with nothing else on their plates. And I might add," I said, "that when these birds are properly cooked, they're at least worth a stab of the fork." Indeed, under the dense foliage of this wood, a whole host of parrots fluttered from branch to branch, needing only the proper upbringing to speak human dialects. At present, they were cackling in chorus with parakeets of every color, with solemn cockatoos that seemed to be pondering some philosophical problem. while bright red lories passed by like pieces of bunting borne on the breeze, in the midst of Kaleo parrots raucously on the wing. Papuan lories painted the subtlest shades of azure, and a whole variety of delightful winged creatures, none terribly edible. However, one bird unique to these shores, which never passes beyond the boundaries of the Aru and Papuan Islands, was missing from this collection. But I was given a chance to marvel at it soon enough. After crossing through a moderately dense thicket, we again found some plains obstructed by bushes. There I saw some magnificent birds soaring aloft, the arrangement of their long feathers causing them to head into the wind. Their undulating flight, the grace of their aerial curves, and the play of their colors allured and delighted the eye. I had no trouble identifying them. "Birds of paradise!" I exclaimed. "Order Passeriforma, division Clystomora," Conseil replied. "Partridge family?" Ned Land asked. "I doubt it, Mr. Land. Nevertheless, I'm counting on your dexterity to catch me one of these delightful representatives of tropical nature." "I'll give it a try, Professor, though I'm handier with a harpoon than a rifle." Malaysians, who do a booming business in these birds with the Chinese, have various methods for catching them that we couldn't use. Sometimes they set snares on the tops of the tall trees that the bird of paradise prefers to inhabit. At other times, they capture it with a tenacious glue that paralyzes its movements. They will even go so far as to poison the springs where these fowl habitually drink. But in our case, all we could do was fire at them on the wing, which left us little chance of getting one. And in truth, we used up a good part of our ammunition in vain. Near 11 o'clock in the morning, we cleared the lower slopes of the mountains that form the island's center, and we still hadn't bagged a thing. Hunger spurred us on. The hunters had counted on consuming the proceeds of their hunting, and they had miscalculated. Luckily, and much to his surprise, Conseil pulled off a right and left shot and ensured our breakfast. He brought down a white pigeon and a ringdove, which were briskly plucked, hung from a spit, and roasted over a blazing fire of dead wood. While these fascinating animals were cooking, Ned prepared some bread from the artocarpus. Then the pigeon and ringdove were devoured to the bones and declared excellent. Nutmeg, on which these birds habitually gorge themselves, sweetens their flesh and makes it delicious eating. "They taste like chicken stuffed with truffles," Conseil said. "All right, Ned," I asked the Canadian. "Now, what do you need?" "Game with 4 paws, Professor Aronnax," Ned Land replied. "All these pigeons are only appetizers, snacks, so till I've bagged an animal with cutlets, I won't be happy." "Nor I, Ned, until I've caught a bird of paradise." "Then let's keep hunting," Conseil replied, "but while heading back to the sea. We've arrived at the foothills of these mountains, and I think we'll do better if we return to the forest regions." It was good advice, and we took it. After an hour's walk, we reached a genuine sago palm forest. A few harmless snakes fled underfoot. Birds of paradise stole off at our approach, and I was in real despair of catching one, when Conseil, walking in the lead, stooped suddenly, gave a triumphant shout, and came back to me carrying a magnificent bird of paradise. "Oh, bravo, Conseil!" I exclaimed. "Master is too kind," Conseil replied. "Not at all, my boy. That was a stroke of genius, catching one of these live birds with your bare hands. If master will examine it closely, he'll see that I deserve no great praise." "And why not, Conseil?" "Because this bird is as drunk as a lord." "Drunk?" "Yes, master, drunk from the nutmegs it was devouring under that nutmeg tree where I caught it. See, Ned, my friend, see the monstrous results of intemperance?" "Damnation," the Canadian shot back. "Considering the amount of gin I've had these past 2 months, you've got nothing to complain about." Meanwhile, I was examining this unusual bird. Conseil was not mistaken. Tipsy from that potent juice, our bird of paradise had been reduced to helplessness. It was unable to fly. It was barely able to walk. But this didn't alarm me, and I just let it sleep off its nutmeg. This bird belonged to the finest of the 8 species credited to Papua and its neighboring islands. It was a great emerald, one of the rarest birds of paradise. It measured 3 decimeters long. Its head was comparatively small, and its eyes, placed near the opening of its beak, were also small. But it offered a wonderful mixture of hues: a yellow beak, brown feet and claws, hazel wings with purple tips, pale yellow head and scruff of the neck, emerald throat, the belly and chest maroon to brown, 2 strands made of a horn substance covered with down, rose over its tail, which was lengthened by long, very light feathers of wonderful fineness, and they completed the costume of this marvelous bird that the islanders have poetically named the Sunbird. How I wished I could take this superb bird of paradise back to Paris to make a gift of it to the zoo at the Botanical Gardens, which doesn't own a single live specimen. So it must be a rarity or something? The Canadian asked, in the tone of a hunter who, from the viewpoint of his art, gives the game a pretty low rating. A great rarity, my gallant comrade, and above all, very hard to capture alive. And even after they're dead, there's still a major market for these birds. So the natives have figured out how to create fake ones, like people create fake pearls or diamonds. What? Conseil exclaimed. They make counterfeit birds of paradise? Yes, Conseil. And is master familiar with how the islanders go about it? Perfectly familiar. During the easterly monsoon season, birds of paradise lose the magnificent feathers around their tails that naturalists call below the wing feathers. These feathers are gathered by the fowl forgers and skillfully fitted onto some poor previously mutilated parakeet. Then they paint over the suture, varnish the bird, and ship the fruits of their unique labors to museums and collectors in Europe. Good enough, Ned Land put in. If it isn't the right bird, it's still the right feathers, and so long as the merchandise isn't meant to be eaten, I see no great harm. But if my desires were fulfilled by the capture of this bird of paradise, those of our Canadian huntsmen remained unsatisfied. Luckily, near 2 o'clock, Ned Land brought down a magnificent wild pig of the type the natives call bari outang. This animal came in the nick of time for us to bag some real quadruped meat, and it was warmly welcomed. Ned Land proved himself quite gloriously with his gunshot. Hit by an electric bullet, the pig dropped dead on the spot. The Canadian properly skinned and cleaned it, after removing half a dozen cutlets destined to serve as the grilled meat course of our evening meal. Then the hunt was on again, and once more would be marked by the exploits of Ned and Conseil. In essence, beating the bushes, the two friends flushed a herd of kangaroos that fled by bounding away on their elastic paws. But these animals didn't flee so swiftly that our electric capsules couldn't catch up with them. "Oh, Professor!" shouted Ned Land, whose hunting fever had gone to his brain. "What excellent game, especially in a stew! What a supply for the Nautilus! 2, 3, 5 down! And just think how we'll devour all this meat ourselves, while those numbskulls on board won't get a shred." In his uncontrollable glee, I think the Canadian might have slaughtered the whole horde if he hadn't been so busy talking, but he was content with a dozen of these fascinating marsupials, which make up the first order of placental mammals, as Conseil just had to tell us. These animals were small in stature. They were a species of those rabbit kangaroos that usually dwell in the hollows of trees and are tremendously fast, but although of moderate dimensions, they at least furnish a meat that's highly prized. We were thoroughly satisfied with the results of our hunting. A gleeful Ned proposed that we return the next day to this magic island, which he planned to depopulate of its every edible quadruped. But he was reckoning without events. By 6 o'clock in the evening, we were back on the beach. The skiff was aground in its usual place. The Nautilus, looking like a long reef, emerged from the waves 2 miles offshore. Without further ado, Ned Land got down to the important business of dinner. He came wonderfully to terms with its entire cooking. Grilling over the coals, those cutlets from the bari outang soon gave off a succulent aroma that perfumed the air. But I catch myself following in the Canadian's footsteps. Look at me, in ecstasy over freshly grilled pork. Please grant me a pardon, as I've already granted one to Mr. Land, and on the same grounds. In short, dinner was excellent. 2 ring doves rounded out this extraordinary menu, sago pasta, bread from the artocarpus, mangoes, half a dozen pineapples, and the fermented liquor from certain coconuts heightened our glee. I suspect that my 2 fine companions weren't quite as clear-headed as one could wish. "What if we don't return to the Nautilus this evening?" Conseil said. "What if we never return to it?" Ned Land added. Just then a stone whizzed toward us, landed at our feet, and cut short the harpooner's proposition. End of chapter 21. Recording by Yvonne Smith. "20,000 Leagues Under the Sea" by Jules Verne. Translated by F.P. Walter. Chapter 22. The Lightning Bolts of Captain Nemo. Without standing up, we stared in the direction of the forest, my hand stopping halfway to my mouth, Ned Land's completing its assignment. "Stones don't fall from the sky," Conseil said, "or else they deserve to be called meteorites." A second well-polished stone removed a tasty ringdove leg from Conseil's hand, giving still greater relevance to his observation. We all three stood up, rifles to our shoulders, ready to answer any attack. "Apes, maybe?" Ned Land exclaimed. "Nearly," Conseil replied. "Savages." "Head for the skiff," I said, moving toward the sea. Indeed, it was essential to beat a retreat, because some 20 natives, armed with bows and slings, appeared barely 100 paces off, on the outskirts of a thicket that masked the horizon to our right. The skiff was aground 10 fathoms away from us. The savages approached without running, but they favored us with a show of the greatest hostility. It was raining stones and arrows. Ned Land was unwilling to leave his provisions behind, and despite the impending danger, he clutched his pig on one side, his kangaroos on the other, and scampered off with respectable speed. In 2 minutes, we were on the strand. Loading provisions and weapons into the skiff, pushing it to sea, and positioning its 2 oars were the work of an instant. We hadn't gone 2 cable lengths when 100 savages, howling and gesticulating, entered the water up to their waists. I looked to see if their appearance might draw some of the Nautilus's men onto the platform, but no, lying well out, that enormous machine still seemed completely deserted. 20 minutes later, we boarded ship. The hatches were open. After mooring the skiff, we re-entered the Nautilus's interior. I went below to the lounge, from which some chords were wafting. Captain Nemo was there, leaning over the organ, deep in a musical trance. "Captain," I said to him. He didn't hear me. "Captain," I went on, touching him with my hand. He trembled, and turning around, "Ah, it's you, Professor," he said to me. "Well, did you have a happy hunt? Was your herb gathering a success?" "Yes, Captain," I replied, "but unfortunately we brought back a horde of bipeds whose proximity worries me." "What sort of bipeds?" "Savages." "Savages?" Captain Nemo replied in an ironic tone. "You set foot on one of the shores of this globe, Professor, and you're surprised to find savages there? Where aren't there savages? And besides, are they any worse than men elsewhere, these people you call savages?" "But Captain—" "Speaking for myself, sir, I've encountered them everywhere." "Well then," I replied, "if you don't want to welcome them aboard the Nautilus, you'd better take some precautions." "Easy, Professor, no cause for alarm." "But there are a large number of these natives." "What's your count?" "At least 100. "Professor Aronnax," replied Captain Nemo, whose fingers took their places again on the organ keys, "if every islander in Papua were to gather on that beach, the Nautilus would still have nothing to fear from their attacks." The captain's fingers then ran over the instrument's keyboard, and I noticed that he touched only its black keys, which gave his melodies a basically Scottish color. Soon he had forgotten my presence and was lost in a reverie that I no longer tried to dispel. I climbed onto the platform. Night had already fallen because in this low latitude, the sun sets quickly without any twilight. I could see Gueboroa Island only dimly. But numerous fires had been kindled on the beach, attesting that the natives had no thoughts of leaving it. For several hours, I was left to myself, sometimes musing on the islanders, but no longer fearing them, because the captain's unflappable confidence had won me over, and sometimes forgetting them to marvel at the splendors of this tropical night. My memories took wing toward France, in the wake of those zodiacal stars due to twinkle over it in a few hours. The moon shone in the midst of the constellations at their zenith. I then remembered that this loyal, good-natured satellite would return to the same place the day after tomorrow, to raise the tide and tear the Nautilus from its coral bed. Near midnight, seeing that all was quiet over the darkened waves as well as under the waterside trees, I repaired to my cabin and fell into a peaceful sleep. The night passed without mishap. No doubt the Papuans had been frightened off by the mere sight of this monster aground in the bay, because our hatches stayed open, offering easy access to the Nautilus's interior. At 6 o'clock in the morning, January 8th, I climbed onto the platform. The morning shadows were lifting. The island was soon on view through the dissolving mists. First its beaches, then its summits. The islanders were still there, in greater numbers than on the day before, perhaps 500 or 600 of them. Taking advantage of the low tide, some of them had moved forward over the heads of coral to within 2 cable lengths of the Nautilus. I could easily distinguish them. They obviously were true Papuans, men of fine stock, athletic in build, forehead high and broad, nose large but not flat, teeth white. Their woolly red-tinted hair was in sharp contrast to their bodies, which were black and glistening like those of Nubians. Beneath their pierced, distended earlobes, there dangled strings of beads made from bone. Generally, these savages were naked. I noted some women among them, dressed from hip to knee in grass skirts held up by belts made of vegetation. Some of the chieftains adorned their necks with crescents and with necklaces made from beads of red and white glass. Armed with bows, arrows, and shields, nearly all of them carried from their shoulders a sort of net, which held those polished stones their slings hurl with such dexterity. One of these chieftains came fairly close to the Nautilus, examining it with care. He must have been a Mado of high rank, because he paraded in a mat of banana leaves that had ragged edges and was accented with bright colors. I could easily have picked off this islander, he stood at such close range, but I thought it best to wait for an actual show of hostility. Between Europeans and savages, it's acceptable for Europeans to shoot back, but not to attack first. During this whole time of low tide, the islanders lurked near the Nautilus, but they weren't boisterous. I often heard them repeat the word "assez," and from their gestures, I understood they were inviting me to go ashore, an invitation I felt obliged to decline. So the skiff didn't leave shipside that day, much to the displeasure of Mr. Land, who couldn't complete his provisions. The adroit Canadian spent his time preparing the meat and flour products he had brought from Gueboroa Island. As for the savages, they went back to shore near 11 o'clock in the morning, when the heads of coral began to disappear under the waves of the rising tide. But I saw their number swell considerably on the beach. It was likely that they had come from neighboring islands or from the mainland of Papua proper. However, I didn't see one local dugout canoe. Having nothing better to do, I decided to dredge these beautiful, clear waters, which exhibited a profusion of shells, zoophytes, and open-sea plants. Besides, it was the last day the Nautilus would spend in these waterways if tomorrow it still floated off to the open sea, as Captain Nemo had promised. So I summoned Conseil, who brought me a small, light dragnet similar to those used in oyster fishing. "What about these savages?" Conseil asked me. "With all due respect to master, they don't strike me as very wicked." "They're cannibals even so, my boy." "A person can be both a cannibal and a decent man," Conseil replied, "just as a person can be both gluttonous and honorable. The one doesn't exclude the other." "Fine, Conseil, and I agree that there are honorable cannibals who decently devour their prisoners. However, I'm opposed to being devoured, even in all decency. So I'll keep on my guard, especially since Nautilus's commander seems to be taking no precautions. And now let's get to work." For 2 hours, our fishing proceeded energetically, but without bringing up any rarities. Our dragnet was filled with Midas abalone, harp shells, obelisk snails, and especially the finest hammer shells I had seen to that day. We also gathered a few sea cucumbers, some pearl oysters, and a dozen small turtles that we saved for the ship's pantry. But just when I least expected it, I laid my hands on a wonder, a natural deformity I'd have to call it, something very seldom encountered. Conseil had just made a cast of the dragnet, and his gear had come back up loaded with a variety of fairly ordinary seashells, when suddenly he saw me plunge my arms swiftly into the net, pull out a shelled animal, and give a conchological yell. In other words, the most piercing yell a human throat can produce. "Eh? What happened to master?" Conseil asked, very startled. "Did master get bitten?" "No, my boy, but I'd gladly have sacrificed a finger for such a find." "What find?" "This shell," I said, displaying the subject of my triumph. "But that's simply an olive shell of the tent olive species, genus Oliva, order Penctinibranchia, class Gastropoda, branch Mollusca." "Yes, yes, Conseil. But instead of coiling from right to left, this olive shell rolls from left to right." "It can't be!" Conseil exclaimed. "Yes, my boy, it's a left-handed shell." "A left-handed shell?" Conseil repeated, his heart pounding. "Look at its spiral." "Oh, master can trust me on this," Conseil said, taking the valuable shell in trembling hands. "But never have I felt such excitement." And there was good reason to be excited. In fact, as naturalists have ventured to observe, dextrality is a well-known law of nature. In their rotational and orbital movements, stars and their satellites go from right to left. Man uses his right hand more often than his left, and consequently his various instruments and equipment, staircases, locks, watch springs, etc., are designed to be used in a right-to-left manner. Now then, nature has generally obeyed this law in coiling her shells. They're right-handed with only rare exceptions, And when by chance a shell spiral is left-handed, collectors will pay its weight in gold for it. So Conseil and I were deep in the contemplation of our treasure, and I was solemnly promising myself to enrich the Paris Museum with it, when an ill-timed stone, hurled by one of the islanders, whizzed over and shattered the valuable object in Conseil's hands. I gave a yell of despair. Conseil pounced on his rifle and aimed at a savage swinging a sling just 10 meters away from him. I tried to stop him, but his shot went off and shattered a bracelet of amulets dangling from the islander's arm. "Conseil!" I shouted. "Conseil!" "Eh? What? Didn't master see that this man-eater initiated the attack?" "A shell isn't worth a human life," I told him. "Oh, the rascal!" Conseil exclaimed. "I'd rather he cracked my shoulder." Conseil was in dead earnest, but I didn't subscribe to his views. However, the situation had changed in only a short time, and we hadn't noticed. Now some 20 dugout canoes were surrounding the Nautilus. Hollowed from tree trunks, these dugouts were long, narrow, and well designed for speed, keeping their balance by means of 2 bamboo poles that floated on the surface of the water. They were maneuvered by skillful half-naked paddlers, and I viewed their advance with definite alarm. It was obvious these Papuans had already entered into relations with Europeans and knew their ships. But this long iron cylinder, lying in the bay with no masts or funnels, what were they to make of it? Nothing good, because at first they kept it at a respectable distance. However, seeing that it stayed motionless, they regained confidence little by little and tried to become more familiar with it. Now then, it was precisely this familiarity that we needed to prevent. Since our weapons made no sound when they went off, they would have only a moderate effect on these islanders, who reputedly respect nothing but noisy mechanisms. Without thunderclaps, lightning bolts would be much less frightening, although the danger lies in the flash, not the noise. Just then the dugout canoes drew nearer to the Nautilus, and a cloud of arrows burst over us. "Fire and brimstone! It's hailing!" Conseil said. "And poisoned hail, perhaps." "We've got to alert Captain Nemo," I said, re-entering the hatch. I went below to the lounge. I found no one there. I ventured a knock at the door opening into the captain's stateroom. The word "enter" answered me. I did so and found Captain Nemo busy with calculations in which there was no shortage of X and other algebraic signs. "Am I disturbing you?" I said out of politeness. "Correct, Professor Aronnax," the captain answered me. "But I imagine you have pressing reasons for looking me up?" "Very pressing. Native dugout canoes are surrounding us, and in a few minutes we're sure to be assaulted by several hundred savages." "Ah," Captain Nemo put in serenely. "They've come in their dugouts?" "Yes, sir." "Well, sir, closing the hatches should do the trick." "Precisely, and that's what I came to tell you." "Nothing easier," Captain Nemo said, and he pressed an electric button, transmitting an order to the crew's quarters. "There, sir, all under control," he told me after a few moments. "The skiff is in place and the hatches are closed. I don't imagine you're worried that these gentlemen will stave in walls that shells from your frigate couldn't breach?" "No, Captain, but one danger still remains." "What's that, sir?" "Tomorrow, at about this time, we'll need to reopen the hatches to renew the Nautilus's air." "No argument, sir, since our craft breathes in the manner favored by cetaceans." "But if these Papuans are occupying the platform at that moment, I don't see how you can prevent them from entering." "Then, sir, you assume they'll board the ship?" "I'm certain of it." "Well, sir, let them come aboard. I see no reason to prevent them. Deep down, they're just poor devils, these Papuans, and I don't want my visit to Gueboroa Island to cost the life of a single one of these unfortunate people." On this note, I was about to withdraw, but Captain Nemo detained me and invited me to take a seat next to him. He questioned me with interest on our excursions ashore and on our hunting, but seemed not to understand the Canadian's passionate craving for red meat. Then our conversation skimmed various subjects, and without being more forthcoming, Captain Nemo proved more affable. Among other things, we came to talk of the Nautilus's circumstances, aground in the same strait where Captain Dumont d'Urville had nearly miscarried. Then, pertinent to this, "He was one of your great seamen," the captain told me, "one of your shrewdest navigators, that d'Urville. He was the Frenchman's Captain Cook, a man wise but unlucky, braving the ice banks of the South Pole, the coral of Oceania, the cannibals of the Pacific, only to perish wretchedly in a train wreck. If that energetic man was able to think about his life in its last seconds, imagine what his final thoughts must have been." As he spoke, Captain Nemo seemed deeply moved, an emotion I felt was to his credit. Then, chart in hand, we returned to the deeds of the French navigator, his voyages to circumnavigate the globe, his double attempt at the South Pole, which led to his discovery of the Adelie coast and the Louis-Philippe Peninsula, finally his hydrographic surveys of the chief islands in Oceania. What your d'Urville did on the surface of the sea, Captain Nemo told me, I've done in the ocean's interior, but more easily, more completely than he. Constantly tossed about by hurricanes, the Zealous and the new Astrolabe couldn't compare with the Nautilus. A quiet workroom, truly at rest in the midst of the waters. Even so, Captain, I said, there is one major similarity between Dumont d'Urville's sloops of war and the Nautilus. What's that, sir? Like them, the Nautilus has run aground. The Nautilus is not aground, sir, Captain Nemo replied icily. The Nautilus was built to rest on the ocean floor, and I don't need to undertake the arduous labors, the maneuvers d'Urville had to attempt in order to float off his sloops of war. The Zealous and the new Astrolabe well nigh perished, but my Nautilus is in no danger. Tomorrow, on the day stated and at the hour stated, the tide will peacefully lift it off, and it will resume its navigating through the seas. Captain, I said, I don't doubt. Tomorrow, Captain Nemo added, standing up. Tomorrow at 2:40 in the afternoon, the Nautilus will float off and exit the Torres Strait undamaged. Pronouncing these words in an extremely sharp tone, Captain Nemo gave me a curt bow. This was my dismissal, and I re-entered my stateroom. There I found Conseil, who wanted to know the upshot of my interview with the captain. My boy, I replied, when I expressed the belief that these Papuan natives were a threat to his Nautilus, the captain answered me with great irony. So I've just one thing to say to you. Have faith in him and sleep in peace. Master has no need for my services? No, my friend. What's Ned Land up to? Begging master's indulgence, Conseil replied, but our friend Ned is concocting a kangaroo pie that will be the 8th wonder. I was left to myself. I went to bed, but slept pretty poorly. I kept hearing noises from the savages who were stamping on the platform and letting out deafening yells. The night passed in this way without the crew ever emerging from their usual inertia. They were no more disturbed by the presence of these man-eaters than soldiers in an armored fortress are troubled by ants running over the armor plate. I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. The hatches weren't open, so the air inside hadn't been renewed, but the air tanks were kept full for any eventuality and would function appropriately to shoot a few cubic meters of oxygen into the Nautilus's thin atmosphere. Nobody on board seemed to be making any preparations for departure. I still waited for a while, then I made my way to the main lounge. Its timepiece marked 2:30. In 10 minutes, the tide would reach its maximum elevation, and if Captain Nemo hadn't made a rash promise, the Nautilus would immediately break free. If not, many months might pass before it could leave its coral bed. But some preliminary vibrations could soon be felt over the boat's hull. I heard its plating grind against the limestone roughness of that coral base. At 2:35, Captain Nemo appeared in the lounge. We're about to depart, he said. Ah, I put in. I've given orders to open the hatches. What about the Papuans? What about them? Captain Nemo replied with a light shrug of his shoulders. Won't they come inside the Nautilus? How will they manage that? By jumping down the hatches you're about to open. Professor Aronnax, Captain Nemo replied serenely, the Nautilus's hatches aren't to be entered in that fashion even when they're open. I gaped at the captain. You don't understand, he said to me. Not in the least. Well, come along and you'll see. I headed to the central companionway. There, very puzzled, Ned Land and Conseil watched the crewmen opening the hatches, while a frightful clamor and furious shouts resounded outside. The hatch lids fell back onto the outer plating. 20 horrible faces appeared, but when the first islander laid hands on the companionway railing, he was flung backward by some invisible power, Lord knows what. He ran off howling in terror and wildly prancing around. 10 of his companions followed him. All 10 met the same fate. Conseil was in ecstasy. Carried away by his violent instincts, Ned Land leapt up the companionway. But as soon as his hand seized the railing, he was thrown backward in his turn. Damnation, he exclaimed. I've been struck by a lightning bolt. These words explained everything to me. It wasn't just a railing that led to the platform. It was a metal cable, fully charged with the ship's electricity. Anyone who touched it got a fearsome shock. And such a shock would have been fatal if Captain Nemo had thrown the full current from his equipment into this conducting cable. It could honestly be said that he had stretched between himself and his assailants a network of electricity no one could clear with impunity. Meanwhile, crazed with terror, the unhinged Papuans beat a retreat. As for us, half laughing, we massaged and comforted poor Ned Land, who was swearing like one possessed. But just then, lifted off by the tide's final undulations, the Nautilus left its coral bed at exactly that 40th minute pinpointed by the captain. Its propeller churned the waves with lazy majesty. Gathering speed little by little, the ship navigated on the surface of the ocean, and safe and sound it left behind the dangerous narrows of the Torres Strait. End of chapter 22. Recording by Yvonne Smith.
"20,000 Leagues Under the Sea" by Jules Verne. Translated by F. P. Walter. Chapter 23. Aigri Somnia. Editor's Note. Chapter title means Troubled Dreams in Latin. The following day, January 10, the Nautilus resumed its travels in mid-water, but at a remarkable speed that I estimated to be at least 35 miles per hour. The propeller was going so fast I could neither follow nor count its revolutions. I thought about how this marvelous electric force not only gave motion, heat, and light to the Nautilus, but even protected it against outside attack, transforming it into a sacred ark no profane hand could touch without being blasted. My wonderment was boundless, and it went from the submersible itself to the engineer who had created it. We were traveling due west, and on January 11 we doubled Cape Wessel, located in longitude 135 degrees and latitude 10 degrees north, the western tip of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Reefs were more numerous, but more widely scattered, and were fixed on the chart with the greatest accuracy. The Nautilus easily avoided the money breakers to port and the Victoria Reefs to starboard, positioned at longitude 130 degrees on the 10th parallel, which we went along rigorously. On January 13, arriving in the Timor Sea, Captain Nemo raised the island of that name at longitude 122 degrees. This island, whose surface area measures 1,625 square leagues, is governed by Rajas. These aristocrats deem themselves the sons of crocodiles, in other words, descendants with the most exalted origins to which a human being can lay claim. Accordingly, their scaly ancestors infest the island's rivers and are the subject of special veneration. They are sheltered, nurtured, flattered, pampered, and offered a ritual diet of nubile maidens, and woe to the foreigner who lifts a finger against these sacred saurians. But the Nautilus wanted nothing to do with these nasty animals. Timor Island was visible for barely an instant at noon, while the chief officer determined his position. I also caught only a glimpse of little Roti Island, part of this same group, whose women have a well-established reputation for beauty in the Malaysian marketplace. After our position fix, the Nautilus's latitude bearings were modulated to the southwest. Our prow pointed to the Indian Ocean. Where would Captain Nemo's fancies take us? Would he head up to the shores of Asia? Would he pull nearer to the beaches of Europe? Unlikely choices for a man who avoided populated areas. So would he go down south? Would he double the Cape of Good Hope, then Cape Horn, and push on to the Antarctic Pole? Finally, would he return to the seas of the Pacific, where his Nautilus could navigate freely and easily? Time would tell. After cruising along the Cartier, Hibernia, Seringapatam, and Scott reefs, the solid element's last exertions against the liquid element, we were beyond all sight of shore by January 14. The Nautilus slowed down in an odd manner, and very unpredictable in its ways. It sometimes swam in the midst of the waters, sometimes drifted on their surface. During this phase of our voyage, Captain Nemo conducted interesting experiments on the different temperatures in various strata of the sea. Under ordinary conditions, such readings are obtained using some pretty complicated instruments whose findings are dubious to say the least, whether they're thermometric sounding lines whose glass often shatters under the water's pressures, or those devices based on the varying resistance to metals to electric currents. The results so obtained can't be adequately double-checked. By contrast, Captain Nemo would seek the sea's temperatures by going himself into its depths, and when he placed his thermometer in contact with the various layers of liquid, he found the sought-for degree immediately, and with certainty. And so, by loading up its ballast tanks, or by sinking obliquely with its slanting fins, the Nautilus successfully reached depths of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 7,000, 9,000, and 10,000 meters, and the ultimate conclusion from these experiments was that in all latitudes the sea had a permanent temperature of 4.5 degrees centigrade at a depth of 1,000 meters. I watched these experiments with the most intense fascination. Captain Nemo brought a real passion to them. I often wondered why he took these observations. Were they for the benefit of his fellow man? It was unlikely, because sooner or later his work would perish with him in some unknown sea. Unless he intended the results of his experiments for me. But that meant this strange voyage of mine would come to an end, and no such end was in sight. Be that as it may, Captain Nemo also introduced me to the different data he had obtained on the relative densities of the water in our globe's chief seas. From this news I derived some personal enlightenment, having nothing to do with science. It happened on the morning of January 15. The captain, with whom I was strolling on the platform, asked me if I knew how salt water differs in density from sea to sea. I said no, adding that there was a lack of rigorous scientific observations on this subject. "I've taken such observations," he told me, "and I can vouch for their reliability." "Fine," I replied, "but the Nautilus lives in a separate world, and the secrets of its scientists don't make their ways ashore." "You're right, Professor," he told me after a few moments of silence. "This is a separate world. It's as alien to the Earth as planets accompanying our globe around the sun, and will never become familiar with the work of scientists on Saturn or Jupiter. But since fate has linked our two lives, I can reveal the results of my observations to you." "I'm all attention, Captain." "You're aware, Professor, that salt water is denser than fresh water. But this density isn't uniform. In essence, if I represent the density of fresh water by 1.000, then I find 1.028 for the waters of the Atlantic, 1.026 for the waters of the Pacific, 1.030 for the waters of the Mediterranean. Aha, I thought, so he ventures into the Mediterranean. 1.018 for the waters of the Ionian Sea, and 1.029 for the waters of the Adriatic. Assuredly, the Nautilus didn't avoid the heavily traveled seas of Europe, and from this insight I concluded that the ship would take us back, perhaps very soon, to more civilized shores. I expected Ned Land to greet this news with unfeigned satisfaction. For several days our work hours were spent in all sorts of experiments, on the degree of salinity in waters of different depths, or on their electric properties, coloration, and transparency, and in every instance Captain Nemo displayed an ingenuity equaled only by his graciousness toward me. Then I saw no more of him for some days, and again lived on board in seclusion. On January 16, the Nautilus seemed to have fallen asleep, just a few meters beneath the surface of the water. Its electric equipment had been turned off, and the motionless propeller let it ride with the waves. I assumed that the crew were busy with interior repairs, required by the engine's strenuous mechanical action. My companions and I then witnessed an unusual sight. The panels in the lounge were open, and since the Nautilus's beacon was off, a hazy darkness reigned in the midst of the waters. Covered with heavy clouds, the stormy sky gave only the faintest light to the ocean's upper strata. I was observing the state of the sea under these conditions, and even the largest fish were nothing more than ill-defined shadows, when the Nautilus was suddenly transferred into broad daylight. At first I thought the beacon had gone back on, and was casting its electric light into the liquid mass. I was mistaken, and after a hasty examination I discovered my error. The Nautilus had drifted into the midst of some phosphorescent strata, which in this darkness came off as positively dazzling. This effect was caused by myriads of tiny luminous animals, whose brightness increased when they glided over the metal hull of our submersible. In the midst of these luminous sheets of water, I then glimpsed flashes of light, like those seen inside a blazing furnace from streams of molten lead or from masses of metal brought to a white heat, flashes so intense that certain areas of the light became shadows by comparison, in a fiery setting from which every shadow should seemingly have been banished. No, this was no longer the calm emission of our usual lighting. The light throbbed with unprecedented vigor and activity. You sensed that it was alive. In essence, it was a cluster of countless open-sea infusoria, of noctiluca an eighth of an inch wide, actual globules of transparent jelly equipped with a thread-like tentacle, up to 25,000 of which had been counted in 30 cubic centimeters of water, and the power of their light was increased by those glimmers. Unique to medusas, starfish, common jellyfish, angel-winged clams, and other phosphorescent zoophytes, which were saturated with grease from organic matter decomposed by the sea, and perhaps with mucus secreted by fish. For several hours the Nautilus drifted in this brilliant tide, and our wonderment grew when we saw huge marine mammals cavorting in it, like the fire-dwelling salamanders of myth. In the midst of these flames that didn't burn, I could see swift, elegant porpoises, the tireless pranksters of the sea, and sailfish 3 meters long, those shrewd heralds of hurricanes, whose fearsome broadswords sometimes banged against the lounge window. Then smaller fish appeared, miscellaneous triggerfish, leatherjacks, unicornfish, and 100 others that left stripes on this luminous atmosphere in their course. Some magic lay behind this dazzling sight. Perhaps some atmospheric condition had intensified this phenomenon. Perhaps a storm had been unleashed on the surface of the waves. But only a few meters down, the Nautilus felt no tempest fury, and the ship rocked peacefully in the midst of the calm waters. And so it went, some new wonder constantly delighting us. Conseil observed and classified his zoophytes, articulates, mollusks, and fish. The days passed quickly, and I no longer kept track of them. Ned, as usual, kept looking for changes of pace from our standard fare. Like actual snails, we are at home in our shell, and I can vouch that it's easy to turn into a full-fledged snail. So this way of living began to seem simple and natural to us, and we no longer envisioned a different lifestyle on the surface of the planet Earth, when something happened to remind us of our strange circumstances. On January 18, the Nautilus lay in longitude 105 degrees and latitude 15 degrees south. The weather was threatening, the sea rough and billowy. The wind was blowing a strong gust from the east. The barometer, which had been falling for some days, forecast an approaching struggle of the elements. I had climbed onto the platform just as the chief officer was taking his readings of hour angles. Out of habit, I waited for him to pronounce his daily phrase. But that day it was replaced by a different phrase, just as incomprehensible. Almost at once I saw Captain Nemo appear, lift his spyglass, and inspect the horizon. For some minutes the captain stood motionless, rooted to the spot contained within the field of his lens. Then he lowered his spyglass and exchanged about 10 words with his chief officer. The latter seemed to be in the grip of an excitement he tried in vain to control. More in command of himself, Captain Nemo remained cool. Furthermore, he seemed to be raising certain objections that his chief officer kept answering with flat assurances. At least that's what I gathered from their differences in tone and gesture. As for me, I stared industriously in the direction under observation, but without spotting a thing. Sky and water merged into a perfectly clean horizon line. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo strolled from one end of the platform to the other, not glancing at me, perhaps not even seeing me. His step was firm, but less regular than usual. Sometimes he would stop, cross his arms over his chest, and observe the sea. What could he be looking for over that immense expanse? By then the Nautilus lay hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. The chief officer kept lifting his spyglass and stubbornly examining the horizon, walking up and down, stamping his foot, in his nervous agitation a sharp contrast to his superior. But this mystery would inevitably be cleared up, and soon, because Captain Nemo gave orders to increase speed. At once the engine stepped up its drive power, setting the propeller in swifter rotation. Just then the chief officer drew the captain's attention anew. The latter interrupted his strolling, and aimed his spyglass at the point indicated. He observed it a good while. As for me, deeply puzzled, I went below to the lounge and brought back an excellent long-range telescope I habitually used. Leaning my elbows on the beacon housing, which jutted from the stern of the platform, I got set to scour that whole stretch of sky and sea, but no sooner had I peered into the eyepiece than the instrument was snatched from my hands. I spun around. Captain Nemo was standing before me, but I almost didn't recognize him. His facial features were transfigured. Gleaming with dark fire, his eyes had shrunk beneath his frowning brow. His teeth were half bared. His rigid body, clenched fists, and head drawn between his shoulders. He didn't move. My spyglass fell from his hand and rolled at his feet. Had I accidentally caused these symptoms of anger? Did this incomprehensible individual think I had detected some secret forbidden to guests on the Nautilus? No, I wasn't the subject of his hate, because he wasn't even looking at me. His eyes stayed stubbornly focused on that inscrutable point on the horizon. Finally, Captain Nemo regained his self-control. His facial appearance, so profoundly changed, now resumed its usual calm. He addressed a few words to his chief officer in their strange language, then he turned to me. "Professor Aronnax," he told me in a tone of some urgency, "I ask that you now honor one of the binding agreements between us." "Which one, Captain?" "You and your companions must be placed in confinement until I see fit to set you free." "You're in command," I answered, gaping at him. "But may I address a question to you?" "You may not, sir." After that, I stopped objecting and started obeying, since resistance was useless. I went below to the cabin occupied by Ned Land and Conseil, and I informed them of the captain's decision. I'll let the reader decide how this news was received by the Canadian. In any case, there was no time for explanations. 4 crewmen were waiting at the door, and they led us to the cell where we had spent our first night aboard the Nautilus. Ned Land tried to lodge a complaint, but the only answer he got was a door shut in his face. "Will master tell me what this means?" Conseil asked me. I told my companions what had happened. They were as astonished as I was, but no wiser. Then I sank into deep speculation, and Captain Nemo's strange facial seizure kept haunting me. I was incapable of connecting 2 ideas in logical order, and I had strayed into the most absurd hypotheses, when I was snapped out of my mental struggles by these words from Ned Land. "Well, look here! Lunch is served!" Indeed, the table had been laid. Apparently Captain Nemo had given this order at the same time he commanded the Nautilus to pick up speed. "Will master allow me to make him a recommendation?" Conseil asked me. "Yes, my boy," I replied. "Well, master needs to eat his lunch. It's prudent, because we have no idea what the future holds." "You're right, Conseil." "Unfortunately," Ned Land said, "they've only given us the standard menu." "Ned, my friend," Conseil answered, "what would you say if they had given us no lunch at all?" This dose of sanity cut the harpooner's complaints clean off. We sat down at the table. Our meal proceeded pretty much in silence. I ate very little. Conseil, everlastingly prudent, force-fed himself. And despite the menu, Ned Land didn't waste a bite. Lunch over, each of us propped himself in a corner. Just then the luminous globe lighting our cell went out, leaving us in profound darkness. Ned Land soon dozed off, and to my astonishment, Conseil also fell into a heavy slumber. I was wondering what could have caused this urgent need for sleep, when I felt a dense torpor saturate my brain. I tried to keep my eyes open, but they closed in spite of me. I was in the grip of anguished hallucinations. Obviously, some sleep-inducing substance had been laced into the food we'd just eaten. So, imprisonment wasn't enough to conceal Captain Nemo's plans from us. Sleep was needed as well. Then I heard the hatches close. The sea's undulations, which had been creating a gentle rocking motion, now ceased. Had the Nautilus left the surface of the ocean? Was it re-entering the motionless strata deep in the sea? I tried to fight off this drowsiness. It was impossible. My breathing grew weaker. I felt a mortal chill freeze my dull, nearly paralyzed limbs. Like little domes of lead, my lids fell over my eyes. I couldn't raise them. A morbid sleep, full of hallucinations, seized my whole being. Then the visions disappeared and left me in utter oblivion. End of chapter 23. Recording by Mike Johnson.